Are you lying comfortably right now? Maybe your room is dark. Maybe the sound of your breathing is the only thing you hear. But just imagine, for a moment, that you are not in your room. Imagine you were in a stone-built chamber thousands of years ago in the heart of ancient Greece. The moon is spilling pale silver light through a narrow window, casting long shadows across the cold floor. Somewhere nearby, you hear the quiet sound of sandals sliding across marble, but you cannot move. You cannot say no, because you, in this moment, are not a free person. You are something else. You are what the Greeks once called an eromenos, beautiful boy, a male concubine, living in the spaces between luxury and horror. Your life is wrapped in silk and oil, but beneath it, there is something far more chilling. You have been purchased, trained, and decorated not as a lover, but as a possession of pleasure. And the strangest part? This was normal, perfectly acceptable. A part of everyday elite life in Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and beyond. Now close your eyes for a second. Picture a vast market at the edge of the Agora, the public square of Athens, where olive oil and honey are sold, where philosophers debate and common people trade fabric. But behind the curtains of certain stalls, there is another kind of market, a quieter one, where no loud bargaining takes place. Here, the currency is beauty. The product? Young boys, usually between 12 and 17, their faces powdered with fine white chalk, their lips reddened with crushed pomegranate, their bodies oiled to gleam in the torchlight. Some of these boys are slaves taken during wars, captured from Thrace, Persia, or Asia Minor. Others are sold by desperate parents who cannot afford to feed them. Some are even groomed from birth by wealthy households, trained in music, poetry, and soft manners, prepared not for citizenship or war, but for the bedroom. Their names are sometimes changed to sound more poetic. Their hair is curled, sometimes bleached with ash to create a glowing halo in the lamplight. They are dressed in light linen, tied loosely at the shoulder so that a single gesture can reveal them completely. Their bodies are perfumed with exotic oils, myrrh, spikenard, and cinnamon knot for their comfort, but to make their presence irresistible to their owners. In the grand symposiums, the all-male drinking parties of the Greek elite, these boys are not just entertainment. They pour the wine, sing soft songs, and play the lyre. But later in the night, when the older men have drunk their fill, the real expectations begin. The room may be filled with laughter and philosophical debates, but for the concubines, there is no debate. They are expected to submit. Sometimes it is framed as education, a rite of passage for the boy and a display of power for the man. But make no mistake, this was not kindness nor mentorship. For the boys, it was survival. If they resisted, they risked punishment, beating, or even death. And yet, if they appeared too eager, they were mocked and shamed. The line was razor thin. Be beautiful, but not seductive. Be passive, but not cold. Be compliant, but not willing. This strange contradiction was baked into Greek culture. Philosophers like Plato wrote about love between men as a noble thing, but in practice, it often looked very different. The love praised in poetry was not what these concubines experienced. They lived as living ornaments, silent and soft, draped in aesthetic perfection, but stripped of control. Their private lives were microscopic. Every detail of their appearance was controlled. Their body hair was managed according to the preferences of the owner. Some boys were waxed smooth from head to toe, a sign of delicacy. Others were left with specific patches of hair intact because certain men found that erotic. Their diet was even monitored not for health, but for aesthetics. They were fed just enough to keep their bodies soft, but not so much that they would grow muscular or mature too quickly. Thinness was admired, but too much fragility led to whispers that the boy would not survive the winter. In some cases, special. Herbal concoctions were secretly given to concubines to suppress sexual desire, so they would not seek pleasure on their own terms. This way, they remained emotionally dependent on their master's touch. But there was another layer of cruelty. Love was forbidden. A concubine was allowed to offer affection, but never to feel it. If he became attached to his master, he was mocked as weak. If he loved someone else, he was punished as disloyal. This paradox trapped them in emotional isolation. During the day, many of these boys were shown off like art pieces. Their masters would walk through the streets of Athens, with the boy following just 2 steps behind, dressed in the finest imported fabrics. Other citizens would nod approvingly, as if admiring a rare statue. But behind closed doors, the same. Boy might be forced to entertain groups of men deep into the night, reciting poetry between encounters, his voice trembling. Some masters forced their concubines to sleep in windowless rooms, small stone cubicles, with no doors, so they would never feel privacy. They were to be ready at all times, even if the master woke up in the middle of the night. There were even stories of boys being adorned with gold chains that linked their ankles to the master's bedpost, a symbol of affection, they said, but in truth, a silent prison. And perhaps the most chilling part of all was this: society considered this normal. There were no laws to protect these boys, no rights to claim. They were part of the household economy, like fine vases or exotic pets. And yet, the Greeks believed themselves to be the most civilized people on earth. The contradiction is heavy, isn't it? But what happened when the concubine grew older? When his youthful beauty faded? The reality was brutal. Some were discarded, set free into poverty, their skills of music and charm useless in the labor market. Others were forced into roles as servants, left to watch younger boys take their place. Some masters, believing in eternal beauty, had death. Masks made of their concubines' faces, cast in wax and stored in hidden shrines. There were even rumors of boys who died in service and were secretly buried in the gardens of aristocratic homes, so no scandal would follow. But for the boys who survived into adulthood, the scars were not always visible. They carried the weight of years spent in silent submission, in rooms where their bodies were currency and their thoughts were irrelevant. Now, as you breathe quietly, lying in your bed, you might wonder, how many of these boys dreamed of sleep as an escape, of a night where no one would come into the room, no footsteps in the corridor, no summons whispered in the dark? Tonight, you have that freedom. You can rest without fear. But in ancient Greece, for many young concubines, the night was not a place of rest. It was a theater of survival. And the most horrific part? They were told it was love. But what happened next was even stranger than you might think. The whisper of silk against stone echoed in the dim corridors of ancient Greek homes, a sound so delicate it could lull a listener into forgetting the horror it carried. For the male concubines of this world, the night was not just about waiting. It was about preparing for rituals that blurred the line between sacred and profane, between beauty and ownership. Imagine yourself there now, drifting deeper into this forgotten world. It is the second hour of the symposium, the air heavy with the scent of wine mixed with pine resin, incense curling lazily toward the ceiling beams, and beneath it all, the quiet tension of bodies waiting for what comes next. The male concubines, often referred to as Pays Kalo's beautiful boys, are not merely decorations at these gatherings. Their presence is a signal of status, their youth a reflection of the household's wealth and refinement. But behind the public display, there is private dread. The boys are instructed in the subtle arts of anticipation, how to smile just enough without encouraging unwanted assumptions, how to pour wine without letting the hand tremble, how to meet a man's gaze for precisely 3 seconds, no more, no less. If they break these unspoken rules, they risk punishment. Some concubines learn to move like shadows. their feet padded softly, their breathing controlled, their faces like masks sculpted from ivory. The older men watched them with narrowed eyes, deciding silently who will be summoned first once the formalities of the feast are over. There are no words exchanged about this arrangement. It is simply understood. For the boys, compliance is a survival tactic. They learn to read moods, to predict when a master will prefer laughter and when he will prefer silence. Some are even trained to mimic sleep, so they can be woken and appear serene, their minds already prepared for the demands of the night. In Athens, it was common for wealthy households to hire special trainers, pedagogoi, whose role was not just to teach boys grammar or music, but to coach them in obedience. These mentors taught the boys how to soften their voices, how to fold their bodies into positions of passive beauty, how to make their presence feel like a gentle melody rather than a disruption. But behind closed doors, these same pedagogoi often acted as gatekeepers to more intimate transactions, negotiating the boys' availability like a commodity. And the strangest part? This was not considered scandalous. It was wrapped in philosophical justifications, dressed up as mentorship and cultural education. Philosophers like Socrates and Xenophon discussed love between men as a higher form of affection. But for the concubines, there was little love to be found, only the cold mechanics of submission. In the upper chambers of grand homes, there were special rooms called androns' men's quarters, where the concubines would be brought after the guests had drunk enough to dull their sharpness, but not so much that they forgot their appetites. The andron was decorated with murals of gods and heroes, scenes of battle and triumph, but in the flickering lamplight, the shadows of the boys moving silently across the floor were the real spectacle. Some of the boys were made to wear thin golden circlets around their necks, not tight enough to choke, but close enough to remind them of their place. Their wrists might carry silk ribbons, dyed purple or deep red, signaling ownership, a color, code for the master's preferences. These small details were known only to the inner circle of aristocratic men, a secret language of control. The boys' hygiene was meticulously managed. Before the symposium, they would be bathed in warm water, mixed with rose petals, their bodies scrubbed with pumice stone to remove any imperfections. Some households employed slaves, whose sole duty was to wax the concubines' bodies, removing every hair with resin so that their skin gleamed like polished marble. But not every master wanted smoothness. In certain city-states, like Thebes, it was fashionable to leave a delicate trail of hair along the navel, a symbol of erotic innocence. These preferences could change overnight, and the boys had to adapt constantly, never knowing whether the next day would bring praise or punishment. Their diets were controlled too, not for health, but for appearance. Some were fed sweetened almonds and diluted wine to keep their skin soft, while others were given specific herbs like silphium, believed to suppress unwanted desires. The idea was to make the concubine always dependent, never fully in control, of his hunger or passion. Even sleep was a ritual of control. Many concubines were denied private beds. They slept at the foot of their master's couch, curled like house pets, ready to be called upon at any hour. Some were given no bedding at all, forced to lie on woven mats just outside the andron, so that the master's slightest movement could wake them. They were never truly asleep. They hovered in a liminal state between rest and readiness. The walls of these rooms were silent witnesses to whispered commands and muffled cries. And yet, in public, the same men who controlled these boys would recite poetry about virtue and self-restraint. This duality was part of the Greek elite's identity, a life lived between philosophical ideals and private indulgences. But for the concubines, the contradiction was not abstract. It was carved into their daily existence. Some boys were told they were lucky to be chosen, that their beauty had earned them a place among the elite. But the reality was darker. They were possessions dressed as companions, their lives a quiet performance of compliance. And there were deeper horrors still. In some regions, it was customary to bind a concubine's feet lightly with silk cords before he was presented at a gathering, not tight enough to cause injury, but just enough to prevent him from running away. This symbolic binding was called the knot of Iris, a ritual said to enhance desire by creating vulnerability. For the boy, it was a message: you are here to stay. You will not leave until dismissed. But what happened when a concubine aged out of his role? When his voice deepened, when his shoulders broadened, when his boyish charm faded into manhood? In some cases, he was sold again, this time as a labor slave, or given away to another master as a token of political friendship. Others were discarded into the streets, stripped of the soft life they once knew, left to beg or sell their services in less dignified ways. Some tried to build new identities as artists or musicians, but the stain of their past followed them. It was whispered about at markets, in bathhouses, in quiet corners of temples. That man was once so-and-so's boy. It was not a title easily shed. There were even stories of concubines who took their own lives rather than face the slow erasure of aging. One tale, written in the margins of an ancient manuscript, tells of a boy named Callimachus who bound his wrists with the same silk ribbons he once wore as adornment and walked into the sea at dawn, disappearing beneath the waves before the city woke. His master, it is said, commissioned a small statue of him afterward, not from love, but from nostalgia for beauty lost. As you lie quietly now, listening to your breath, think of the silence these boys carried. Their stories were rarely written down. Their voices, like soft echoes in marble halls, faded with time. But the horror they lived was wrapped in ritual, hidden behind art and poetry. And the most unsettling part? This was not considered cruelty. It was called civilization. But there's another layer to this story, something even stranger, that few people know. And it has to do with what happened to these boys after death dot in the quiet of ancient Greek nights. Beneath marble ceilings and flickering oil lamps, there lingered a strange and chilling belief, one that whispered through the corridors of elite homes, one that the concubines could never escape, not even in death. For male concubines in ancient Greece, their bodies were not just consumed during life. They were, in some cases, kept after death. It was a secret practice, whispered among certain aristocratic households, where the preserved remains, or representations, of favored concubines were hidden away, sealed behind doors that no servant was allowed to open. Some of these boys, once adored for their beauty and compliance, were quietly embalmed in oils and wrapped in linens soaked in exotic perfumes, not buried in public cemeteries, but concealed within private shrines. Masters believed that this preserved beauty brought good fortune, as if keeping the boy's presence close would ensure continued wealth and social success. There are ancient inscriptions, faint and almost erased by time, that mention the sleeping companions of noblemen bodies, kept in a state of suspended decay, hidden behind stone panels in the inner chambers of a house. Some scholars argue these were merely symbolic statues, wax effigies sculpted to capture the boy's face at the height of his beauty. But others suggest the truth was far more disturbing. In a few cases, the boy himself was preserved, a human relic of desire frozen in time. This practice was not universal, but its mere existence tells us something haunting about the value placed on these boys, not as people, but as objects of possession. Imagine it now, the stillness of a chamber where no one is allowed to speak loudly, where a body lies forever in half sleep, coated in myrrh and frankincense, eyes closed but lips still curved into the faintest suggestion of a smile. Exactly as they had been trained to appear in life. The house slaves who cleaned and maintained these hidden rooms were sworn to secrecy. They lit lamps at nightfall, placed fresh garlands around the feet of the preserved form, and then backed away quietly, eyes averted, as if touching the air in that room could summon punishment. These rituals were meant to maintain the illusion of youth and beauty beyond the natural limit of time. For the living concubines, this fate became a silent nightmare. Some whispered to each other in the rare moments of privacy that death was not the end of service. It was just another phase of ownership. To die and be displayed forever was, for some, a horror greater than any knightly duty. There are fragments of old papyri found in the rubbish heaps of Oxyrhynchus, scribbled with half-forgotten prayers that concubines supposedly whispered to the gods of sleep, not for peaceful dreams, but for erasure, for non-existence. They prayed not to be remembered, because memory in that world meant continued use, even after death. And yet, for most concubines, the afterlife did not come with rituals of preservation. Their bodies were often discarded in ways that stripped them of dignity. In many cases, they were buried in unmarked graves, sometimes beneath the very homes where they had served, so their spirits would remain bound to the household. This practice was tied to a belief that the concubine's ghost, the eidolon, could protect the master from curses or bad luck. In the darker corners of Greek magic, certain households even performed necromantic rites, summoning the spirit of a dead concubine to ask for favors from the underworld. They would burn specific herbs, like black hellebore and wormwood, while whispering the boy's name into clay figurines, believing that his ghost would become a messenger to Hades, bargaining on their behalf. But for the concubines themselves, this meant their suffering had no guaranteed end. They were commodities in life and tools in death. Some concubines, sensing this, tried to control their fate in the few ways they could. There are rare accounts of boys who escaped in the dead of night, disappearing into the hills, living as bandits or wandering minstrels to avoid the fate of becoming a household ghost. Others attempted to scar their bodies, burning their faces, or cutting their hair to break the illusion of perfection and make themselves less desirable. But these acts of rebellion were dangerous. If a concubine was caught damaging his beauty, he could be punished severely, sometimes even killed, not out of rage, but because he had spoiled an investment. In some cases, the punishment was not death, but disfigurement, a twisted act of ownership, where the master himself would mar the concubine's body so no one else could desire him. Imagine that for a moment, the paradox of being trapped in a role where beauty is demanded, but punished if it steps outside control. It was said that in some elite circles, concubines were treated as living sacrifices to the god Eros, the god of desire. Some temples even performed secret rites where boys were offered symbolically, not killed, but dedicated, marked with tiny tattoos in places that would never be seen in public, such as beneath the arm or along the inner thigh. These tattoos were usually simple words: soma, meaning body, or kleidos, meaning key, signifying that the boy was now a locked possession. These markings bound the concubine spiritually to his master, and it was believed that in the afterlife, the boy would serve the same master again. There was no escape, not even in death. And yet, outwardly, the public view of this system was cloaked in philosophy. Poets wrote verses about youthful love and mentorship. Vase paintings showed tender scenes of older men guiding boys through music and conversation. But beneath this surface, there was a silent machinery of control, a system where beauty was currency and consent was irrelevant. The boys learned to live in this contradiction, their smiles rehearsed, their bodies maintained like living sculptures. They were not allowed to love freely, nor to age naturally. Their desires were erased, replaced by the whims of their masters. Some concubines, desperate for agency, sought out secret healers and midwives, not for physical wounds, but for potions that could make them less beautiful. There were rumors of herbal concoctions that could roughen the skin, change the texture, of hair, or cause weight gain. But these remedies were dangerous and often fatal. Still, for some boys, the risk of death was preferable to the endless performance of beauty. The role of the male concubine in ancient Greece was not simply about sex. It was about power, control, and social hierarchy. It was a carefully maintained illusion that wrapped cruelty in culture, turning personal suffering into a public display of refinement. The concubine became a mirror for the master's status, a reflection of wealth and taste. But behind that mirror was a life filled with fear, exhaustion, and the constant pressure to be perfect. As you rest now, letting your breath slow, imagine the layers of marble and time covering these stories. They were buried, forgotten, erased by historians who preferred to talk of great battles and noble philosophers. But the concubines were there in the shadows of every symposium, in the private rooms of every wealthy house, their lives entwined with the history of desire and control. And there is one more layer to this story, a strange, almost unbelievable chapter about how some concubines were forced into roles far beyond the bedroom, becoming spies, political tools, and secret weapons in the games of the Greek elite. But that, perhaps, is even more unsettling than what you've heard so far. In the soft haze of ancient Greek nights, beyond the echoing laughter of symposiums and the shimmer of oil lamps, there was another layer of horror that male concubines faced, one rarely spoken about even in the hidden corners of scrolls and inscriptions. These boys were not merely used for pleasure or decoration. Some were carefully manipulated into becoming silent tools of espionage, political leverage, and social manipulation. Imagine for a moment the soft-footed concubine standing quietly behind his master's couch at a lavish banquet. He pours the wine with steady hands, his face expressionless, his body adorned with the usual symbols of ownership: a thin gold chain around the neck, perhaps a purple ribbon tied just above the elbow, indicating which household he belongs to. But his mind is not empty. Behind his eyes, there is a recording of every whispered conversation, every glance exchanged between rival politicians, every insult muttered after too much wine. Some masters deliberately placed their concubines in these rooms, not just for beauty, but for information. The boys were trained, not formally in schools, but through subtle daily lessons. They learned to listen without seeming to listen, to memorize the phrases of senators and generals, while pretending to focus only on refilling cups. They were sent between households under the guise of gifts, passed from one aristocrat to another, carrying secrets on their tongues like invisible scrolls. If a concubine returned home after a week in another house, his first task was not to rest, but to report, to quietly whisper into his master's ear the desires, weaknesses, and rivalries he had observed. Some boys were even taught to manipulate these conversations, to steer the drunken talk of men toward confessions and boasts, gathering dangerous knowledge. In this way, concubines became instruments of soft power, their very presence influencing the political landscape of cities like Athens, Corinth, and Thebes. But this role came with terrible risks. If a concubine was caught spying, the punishment was beyond brutal. There are records quietly noted in the back pages of legal scrolls of boys who had their tongues cut out to prevent further leaks, or who were blinded so they could no longer observe sensitive matters. Some were quietly disposed of, their bodies found floating in city wells, whispered about for a few days before being forgotten. And yet, despite these dangers, the practice continued for centuries. The Greek elite found it too useful to stop. In their world, beauty was not just for display. It was a disguise, a mask that concealed sharp eyes and sharper memories. Some concubines even developed personal codes, silent gestures, or changes in posture to communicate secret information to their masters without speaking. A slight tilt of the head might mean a rival has confessed to debt. A subtle touch to the collarbone could signal that an enemy plans to shift alliances. These boys lived double lives, publicly passive, privately powerful. But this power was not freedom. It was another layer of control. They were still owned, still vulnerable to the same abuses as any concubine. They slept in the same windowless rooms, ate from the same controlled diets, and submitted to the same nightly demands. Only now, their minds were burdened too filled, with dangerous knowledge that could kill them if it escaped at the wrong moment. Some boys grew addicted to this role, finding a strange sense of purpose in their secret missions. Others were crushed under the weight of it, developing nervous illnesses described in ancient texts as soul trembling, a condition where the body shakes uncontrollably from suppressed stress. These boys would sometimes be sent to temple healers, who prescribed herbs like valerian and poppy to calm their minds, but the deeper root of their suffering was never addressed. In rare cases, a concubine would rise to a position of real influence. There is a story preserved in fragments of a boy named Dorian, who served as a concubine to a powerful Athenian general. Dorian was said to be so skilled in gathering secrets that his master allowed him to attend council meetings, disguised as a mute attendant. He carried notes in his sleeves, memorized troop movements, and whispered warnings that prevented his master from political downfall more than once. But Dorian's story does not end well. When his master was assassinated in a coup, Dorian was taken by rival politicians who feared what he knew. They did not kill him immediately. Instead, they imprisoned him in a stone chamber beneath the Acropolis, feeding him just enough to survive, questioning him daily about his knowledge of state affairs. His fate after that is unknown. He vanishes from the records, as so many concubines did, swallowed by history's silence. Some scholars believe he died in that chamber. Others suggest he was sold to foreign powers, his mind used until it collapsed. These stories are not isolated. Across Greek city-states, concubines were used as pawns in marital negotiations, in true settlements, and as displays of alliance. It was not uncommon for a general to send his favorite concubine as a peace gift, to a rival knowing full well that the boy would carry secrets, and that the rival would likely do the same in return. This exchange of beautiful boys became a parallel form of diplomacy, one that rarely appeared in official records but was quietly understood by the elite. In some cases, concubines were even used to spread rumors intentionally. A boy might be instructed to let slip a secret at a banquet, knowing it would reach the ears of the right person and influence decisions. In this way, concubines were like living letters, their beauty a cloak for their function as carriers of hidden messages. But for the boys themselves, this life was a labyrinth with no exit. Their roles as spies made them even more isolated. They could not confide in other concubines for fear of betrayal. They could not reveal their inner thoughts to their masters, who saw them as tools rather than people. They lived in constant fear of exposure, knowing that a single mistake could mean torture or death. Some developed elaborate coping rituals touching specific parts of their bodies in certain sequences before speaking, reciting silent prayers to Hermes, the god of cunning and communication, or drawing invisible symbols on their beds at night to ward off discovery. And yet, through all of this, they were expected to maintain their outer roles, to sing, to dance, to pour wine, to be pleasing in form and behavior. Their bodies belonged to pleasure. Their minds belonged to strategy. They were living contradictions, soft and hard at once, fragile but indispensable. As you listen now, with your eyes perhaps half closed, breathing gently in the dark, think of the weight these boys carried, not just on their backs in the physical sense, but in their minds, filled with the shifting sands of politics, desire, and danger. In the stillness of the night, they might have whispered to themselves, wondering whether they were truly human anymore, or merely instruments of other men's ambitions. And the most chilling thought of all? For the Greek elite, this system was not seen as strange or cruel. It was considered brilliant and natural extension of beauty and power combined. But what happened when a concubine learned too much? There are stories of secret rituals, of boys quietly silenced forever, their memories buried not just by death, but by design. The next part of this story, the fate of concubines who became too dangerous to live, is perhaps the darkest chapter of all. There is a silence in history that is heavier than words, the silence of those who knew too much and were made to disappear. In ancient Greece, male concubines who crossed a certain invisible line, who became too clever, too observant, or too entangled in the secrets of powerful men, faced a fate that was even more chilling than slavery or public execution. Their erasure was deliberate, calculated, and wrapped in ritual. Imagine for a moment the corridors of an elite Athenian household late at night. The oil lamps are nearly extinguished, their flames reduced to faint orange embers. The concubine lies awake, his eyes open, staring at the ceiling beams, counting breaths. He knows something that he should not know, something whispered to him by a drunken senator, or something he overheard while pouring wine at a private meeting. Perhaps he knows of a pending betrayal, a planned political coup, or an affair that could destroy a marriage alliance. Whatever it is, the knowledge burns inside his mind, heavy and sharp. And he also knows this. Knowledge makes him dangerous, and dangerous concubines do not live long. There was a term whispered among the Greek elite Somasigen, the silent body. It referred to a concubine who had been removed quietly, without scandal, without public punishment, his fate erased from conversation. Some of these boys simply vanished. A night came when they were told to bathe in perfumed water as usual, their hair combed with ivory picks, their bodies oiled and wrapped in soft linen. But instead of being called to the master's bedchamber or the andron, they were led to a different room, a room with no windows. In some cases, the boy was given a cup of wine laced with opium and henbane, a drink that blurred the edges of reality, making the transition from consciousness to nothingness seamless. He would drift into a dreamlike state, feeling his body melt into warmth, and then he would never wake up again. The masters believed this was mercy, but others preferred a different method, one rooted in the rituals of silence. In these cases, the concubine was led to a temple under the pretense of a religious ceremony. Perhaps it was a blessing of the household's good fortune, or a cleansing rite to prepare for a new season. The boy would kneel before a statue of Apollo or Eros, eyes closed, reciting prayers taught to him since childhood. Behind him, masked attendants, often slaves, trained for this sole purpose, would approach silently. A cord would be placed gently around his neck, woven not from rough rope, but from soft silk, dyed red to symbolize beauty. The end would come quickly, without struggle, because the boy had been taught to obey without question. His body would be carried away before dawn, cremated in secret, or buried in unmarked earth outside the city walls. There would be no public mourning, no funeral procession. His name would be scrubbed from household records, his possessions, if he had any, burned, or redistributed to other concubines. In some cases, his image on painted vases or frescoes was deliberately altered, the features blurred or replaced with anonymous patterns, as if erasing the visual memory could erase the event itself. These disappearances were not accidental. They were part of a system. The Greek elite understood that controlling beauty also meant controlling danger. A concubine who witnessed too much could not be allowed to speak freely, even after retirement. And so, the concept of a soft exit became normal, a whispered practice passed between households, a method of removal that maintained appearances while eliminating risk. Some boys tried to escape this fate by feigning ignorance. They trained themselves to forget, to erase the details of secret conversations from their minds, to become deliberately dull in the eyes of their masters. But even this was not always enough. Sometimes, simply being present in the wrong room at the wrong time was fatal. There were stories of concubines who, while delivering food or wine, overheard plans for military campaigns or witnessed private letters being read aloud. These boys did not survive long after. The household would send them on errands from which they never returned. In Athens, there was a discreet network of enforcers, quiet men, who specialized in removing such threats. They operated in the spaces between law and tradition, answering not to the courts, but to private contracts. Their services were expensive, but for wealthy households, the cost was worth the safety. One such figure was known in whispered stories as the sleeper, a man whose role was to ensure that concubines who learned too much simply fell asleep and never woke up. His methods were gentle, or so the rumors claimed. He used poisons derived from rare plants, white hellebore, aconite, and extracts from the seeds of mandrake. The goal was not pain but disappearance. A quiet ending, like the extinguishing of a lamp flame at midnight. Some historians dismiss these stories as legend, but fragments of household ledgers and temple records hint at payments for special cleansings, expenses listed with vague terms that suggest something more than ordinary maintenance. And then there are the graves small, anonymous burial sites found outside the city walls, containing the remains of young males. No inscriptions, no markers of family or tribe. Archaeologists have puzzled over these for decades. Who were these? Boys? Why were they buried secretly, outside of normal religious rites? The answer, though uncomfortable, aligns with the whispered histories of Soma Saigon. For the concubines themselves, the knowledge of this possible fate hung over every interaction. Imagine the strain of living each day knowing that a single, misplaced word could mean death, not immediate, but soft, orchestrated death disguised as care. They learned to guard not just their bodies, but their thoughts, crafting inner walls of silence. Some boys developed secret codes of memory, ways to hide information, even from themselves. They would assign false meanings to real events, reshaping their recollections so that even under questioning, they could truthfully say they remembered nothing important. Others whispered prayers to Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, asking the gods to erase dangerous knowledge from their minds. In rare cases, a concubine might try to leverage his knowledge for power, threatening to expose secrets if not protected. But this was a perilous gamble. Few who tried survived it. The Greek elite had little patience for blackmail, especially from those they considered property. There is a tale half myth, half history of a boy named Philemon, who served as concubine to a high-ranking Athenian magistrate. Philemon discovered a plot to defraud the city treasury, overheard during a drunken symposium. He tried to negotiate for his freedom, promising silence in exchange. Instead, he was gifted a new tunic, a gold bracelet, and a final meal before vanishing from all records. His bracelet was later found in a market stall, sold by a slave who claimed it came from a forgotten boy. These stories are not the tales of romanticized Greek love found in school books. They are the hidden currents beneath the surface of philosophy. And poetry, the quiet machinery that maintained power through beauty, control, and calculated cruelty. And yet, even in this system, some concubines found ways to survive, not by escaping physically, but by mastering the subtle art of invisibility. They became shadows, perfect servants, neither seen nor remembered, blending so deeply into the background that they outlasted their masters, living into old age as house caretakers or temple attendants, their knowledge locked away forever. But not all were so fortunate. Many slipped into the silence of Soma Saigon, their stories lost, their names erased, their bodies hidden beneath unmarked stones. As you lie in your bed now, breathing softly in the dark, consider the weight of these forgotten lives. They were not warriors, not kings, but they carried burdens heavier than shields or spears. The burden of beauty as currency, of knowledge as a curse, of silence as survival. And yet, there is one final layer to this history, something even more uncanny. Some believe that the ghosts of these concubines linger still not in the supernatural sense, but in the echoes of modern life, in the way society continues to conflate beauty with ownership, desire with control. But that part of the story is for another night. In the lingering quiet of the night, when the symposiums faded into memory and the wine vessels lay empty, some believed that the souls of concubines did not rest, not in the traditional sense. Their presence was said to seep into the marble floors, into the faded murals, into the cracks of the grand columns of Greece's wealthiest homes. And though the philosophers and poets spoke of the afterlife in terms of the Elysian fields or the underworld ruled by Hades, there was another, quieter belief whispered in the shadows of the androns and bathhouses that the male concubine, used and discarded, sometimes became a different kind of spirit altogether. Imagine this: a concubine trained from childhood to serve, to please, to remain silent, now drifts in death between realms, not entirely gone, not fully present. In some parts of ancient Greece, particularly in the border regions where old superstitions lingered alongside newer philosophical ideas, people spoke of the korei ayaroi, the untimely boys, young spirits who died before fulfilling their natural purpose as adult men. These spirits were believed to wander, trapped in the half-light of memory and grief, bound to the houses where they had once served. Their rituals were incomplete, their rites of passage stolen by lives cut short or twisted by unnatural roles. For concubines, this was a terrifying thought, for it meant that even in death, there would be no rest. Households took this belief seriously enough to develop secret ceremonies designed to pacify these wandering spirits. In wealthy homes, small shrines were sometimes built behind walls, invisible to guests, where offerings of honey cakes and milk were left not for the gods but for the boys who had served and vanished. It was said that if these spirits were ignored, the household would suffer. Miscarriages, business failures, or sudden illnesses could strike. The concubine's ghost was not malevolent by nature. It was restless, trapped between service and selfhood, between desire and duty. Some households held quiet midnight rituals, known as lampstand offerings, where a single oil lamp was left burning in an empty room, a slice of fig placed beside it, as an invitation for the spirit to find peace for just one night. But not all concubine ghosts were passive. There are fragmented records of malevolent hauntings, cases where the spirit of a concubine was believed to have turned into something darker, of Rikolakas, or restless dead who visited the masters. Dreams, whispering forgotten secrets, reminding him of promises broken and abuses unatoned. It was said that some concubine spirits lingered near the bedroom doors of their former masters, breathing cold air into the room, standing silently at the foot of the bed while the living tried to sleep. The Greeks, for all their philosophical brilliance, lived in constant tension with superstition. Even Aristotle, in private writings not meant for public teaching, mentioned the dangers of unresolved souls, those who died outside the proper order of life. In this category, the male concubine was the most complex figure, neither fully slave nor citizen, neither lover nor child, suspended in a role society designed but could not fully reconcile. This ambiguity made their spirits powerful in folklore. There are papyrus scraps recovered from Egyptian Greek settlements, places like Alexandria and Naucratis, where spells are written for soothing the boy who walks at night. These spells involve burning certain herbs, mint, myrrh, and saffron, while whispering apologies into a bowl of water, then pouring it at the threshold of the house. It was believed that by performing this rite, a household could prevent the concubines ghost from interfering with fertility or health. But there is another layer to this strange belief system. In some mystery cults, like those of Orpheus and Dionysus, it was taught that the soul of a person who suffered unjustly in life might return in a new form, carrying with it the shadows of the past. Concubines, especially those who died young, were said to be reborn as omens. Some people believed that a sudden gust of wind during a symposium, or a strange flickering of lamplight, meant that a former concubine was present, watching, perhaps listening. These moments were not dismissed as a coincidence. They were interpreted as warnings. And so, households developed subtle ways to acknowledge these presences without speaking of them openly. For example, if a master dropped his drinking cup during a feast, it was customary in some regions to pause and pour a small libation onto the ground, not for the gods, but for the unseen boy. It was a way of saying, "I remember you," without admitting guilt or wrongdoing. But these gestures did not erase the deeper horror, the concubines who died without names, without funerals, without family to mourn them. Their unclaimed spirits floated through the cracks of Greek memory, sometimes appearing in dreams, sometimes becoming the subject of quiet songs sung by household slaves late at night when the masters were asleep. Some of these songs survive. In fragments, lullabies with double meanings, prayers disguised as work chants, warnings woven into melodies about olive groves and moonlit waters. They tell of boys who walk along the edge of sleep, unseen but present, listening, waiting. There were even cases where households sought out professional dream readers to interpret strange visions involving concubines. If a master dreamed of a boy sitting silently in the corner of a symposium hall, eyes lowered, it was taken as a sign that something unresolved needed attention, perhaps a debt of kindness unpaid or a secret still festering beneath layers of public honor. Some families, fearing the consequences of these visits, paid for elaborate rites at the shrines of Hecate, the goddess of boundaries and transitions. Offerings of garlic, eggs, and small coins were buried at crossroads under the cover of darkness, with whispered prayers asking Hecate to guide the concubine's spirit away from the house and toward peace. But not all believed in banishing the young spirit. Some households embraced the presence of their former concubines, treating them as household guardians. In these cases, a small image of the boy might be kept near the hearth, not as a warning, but as a charm. These households believed that the spirit, if treated well after death, could bring good fortune, ward off enemies, or protect against betrayal. It was a complex relationship, part guilt, part affection, part superstition. The concubine, in life, had no autonomy. But in death, his memory became powerful, capable of shaping the fate of those who once controlled him. This belief in the lingering presence of concubine spirits reveals something unsettling about ancient Greek society. The deep awareness, perhaps even subconscious, that what they were doing to these boys was wrong, or at least dangerous to the balance of the world. The rituals of beauty and control, the philosophy of mentorship layered over abuse, could not fully suppress the fear that such acts left a stain, not just on the body, but on the soul. And so, in the quiet spaces of night, as the city slept and the wine cups lay empty, the elite whispered to themselves about ghosts. They poured small drops of wine onto marble floors. They left scraps of honey cake on stone altars. They avoided certain corners of their own houses after dark. The concubines in life were made into objects, but in death they became something. Else silent judges, shadows in the architecture of Greek memory, reminders of a system wrapped in beauty, yet soaked in horror. As you rest now, your breathing slow and calm, imagine the flicker of an oil lamp in a marble room thousands of years ago, the soft rustle of linen in the dark, and the quiet footsteps of someone who should have vanished, but never really did. And the most mysterious part of all? Some say those footsteps can still be heard in dreams, in the half-sleep between waking and rest, where history is never truly silent thought as the night stretches deeper and the ancient oil lamps burn lower. The shadows on the stone walls seem to shift, not with movement, but with memory. In the quiet spaces of the Greek elites' homes, long after the symposiums ended and the guests departed, there existed a ritual far stranger than most modern minds can comprehend. It was not just about beauty, not just about control, but about something even more elusive. The attempt to capture youth itself, to trap it in time, to weave it into the fabric of life so that it could never truly vanish. For the male concubines of ancient Greece, this meant they were not only used as bodies, but transformed into living symbols, talismans of status, objects of obsession. There was a belief, half spiritual, half superstitious, that certain concubines held within them a kind of metaphysical key. This key was not physical, but symbolic, a belief that possessing the right kind of boy could open pathways to fortune, social power, or even divine favor. Some elite men whispered of boys who were marked by the gods, born under auspicious omens, with certain features that made them desirable beyond the ordinary. Pale skin that glowed in moonlight, eyes of unusual color, a particular way of moving that seemed effortless. These boys were not just concubines. They were considered living charms. Some philosophers, like Pythagoreans, believed in the concept of ekmegen, the living echo. They thought that beauty carried a cosmic resonance, and that keeping beauty close could align a household with celestial harmony. For concubines, this meant they were sometimes treated as sacred objects, not out of kindness, but out of a desire to harness their presence for luck, prosperity, or political success. In certain circles, rituals were performed where the concubines' body was gently pressed against the household storage jars or wealth chests, as if to bless the family's grain and gold with the softness of youth. Their hair clippings were kept in small ivory boxes, sealed with wax and buried beneath new construction as offerings to household gods. It was not uncommon for a wealthy man to have his concubines sleep beside his bed, not just for excess, but because he believed the boy's proximity warded off bad dreams or illness. There were even stories of generals who refused to go to war without their concubine nearby, claiming that the boy's presence calmed the fates and softened the god's anger. But beneath these rituals, the concubine's personal experience remained the same: submission, silence, and erasure of self. They were trained to suppress their desires, to become mirrors for their master's needs. Some were forced to learn particular phrases scripts they repeated nightly, so that their presence always reinforced the master's sense of superiority. "I am yours," they whispered, again and again, not because they believed it, but because they had no choice. The philosopher Plato, in his Dialogue Symposium, spoke of love as a ladder, ascending from physical attraction to the love of wisdom and pure forms. But for concubines, there was no ladder, only the bottom rung, held in place by someone else's hand. And yet, in secret, some concubines developed private rituals of their own, small acts of resistance hidden within the daily routine of obedience. There are scattered accounts, written in the margins of household inventories and whispered in old letters of boys who kept personal tokens. A pebble from a river where they once bathed freely, a fragment of cloth from a lost family, or knotted thread tucked inside their tunic, representing wishes for escape. Some scratched hidden symbols into the backs of furniture, tiny carvings that no one noticed, leaving behind traces of their existence, not as objects, but as people. These small acts were not enough to change their fate, but they were acts of memory, of silent rebellion against total erasure. The world they lived in was one of contradictions. Publicly, male concubines were celebrated in poetry and art. Their images appeared on pottery and frescoes. depicted with delicate features and serene expressions. But privately, they were controlled, down to the smallest detail: how they walked, how they spoke, how they held their hands. Some were forced to undergo body modifications to maintain an idealized form. There are medical texts from ancient Greece that describe the use of binding to keep a boy's waist narrow, or herbal treatments to delay the onset of puberty, preventing the deepening of the voice or the growth of facial hair. These interventions were dangerous and often caused illness, but they were done in the name of preserving beauty. The fear of change, the terror of time, drove these practices. To grow older was to become useless in the role of concubine. Some boys, upon reaching a certain age, found themselves discarded, sent away to live in poverty, their skills in music or dance suddenly worthless in the wider world. Others were absorbed into different roles within the household, becoming tutors. For new concubines or silent attendants in temple ceremonies, always remaining within the walls of the system that had shaped them. There are rare cases where a concubine managed to transition into a position of influence, usually by attaching himself to a master who grew dependent on his advice and companionship. But these stories are exceptions, not the rule. Most lived and died in quiet, their names lost, their stories erased. And yet, in the background of Greek society, their influence lingered. The rituals, the superstitions, the nightly routines of the elite all were shaped by the presence of these boys. They were the unspoken foundation of luxury, the invisible scaffolding of status and pleasure. Some modern historians suggest that the entire structure of Greek private life, the symposiums, the mentorship models, the household hierarchies, was built on the backs of concubines whose stories were never meant to be told. Their silence was not just a personal tragedy, but a cultural design. The system depended on it. And so, they became the ghosts of history, present in every vase painting, in every philosophical text that omits their perspective, in every marble statue of an idealized youth gazing into eternity. As you lie in stillness, now breathing softly, imagine those marble eyes watching back not with accusation, but with the quiet weight of forgotten lives. The concubines of ancient Greece were not myths. They were real boys, living in a world that demanded perfection and gave no room for escape. Their beauty was currency, their silence enforced, their existence wrapped in rituals that disguised cruelty as culture. And in the deepest part of the night, when sleep hovers between dreams and memory, you might wonder, how many of history's grand stories were built on the quiet suffering of those who were never allowed to speak? That question lingers, soft as breath, long after the lamps go out. The quiet continuation of history often depends not on kings or wars, but on the unnoticed, the silenced, and the erased. In ancient Greece, the world of male concubines was a hidden architecture beneath the marble temples and philosophical debates, a private layer of society where power dynamics were played out in the softest, most intimate spaces. As you drift deeper into this calm story, let yourself imagine the daily life of a concubine beyond the grand symposiums and the political espionage. Consider the small, private details, the ones no poet wrote about, the ones no vase painter captured, yet the ones that shaped the concubine's every breath. A concubine's morning often began before sunrise. Long before the master stirred from his bed, the boys were woken silently by older slaves, led into cold stone bathing chambers where the first ritual of the day began: purification. Bathing was not a simple act of hygiene. It was a ceremonial routine designed to maintain the concubine's appearance, but also to remind him of his place. Warm water mixed with crushed herbs, basil, mint, and sometimes a hint of rosemary was poured over his shoulders by attendants, who whispered no words, only carried out their tasks with practiced gentleness. His skin was scrubbed with fine sand or pumice stones to remove any imperfections. Any blemish, any bruise, was a problem to be corrected immediately with ointments, perfumes, or concealment techniques. After the bath, the concubine's body was oiled with myrrh or spikenard, the scents chosen carefully by the household, according to the master's preference. Some masters liked their boys to smell of the sea, others of sweet resins or fresh-cut grass. The boys themselves had no say. Even their scent was controlled. Their hair was curled, sometimes artificially lightened with lime and ash to create the glowing appearance of youth. If a boy's hair grew too quickly or changed texture with age, he might be punished, not because it was his fault, but because time itself was his enemy. In rare cases, concubines were instructed to wear wigs woven from their own younger hair, preserved and reattached to maintain the illusion of perfect, unchanging youth. Their garments were specific too. Linen tunics dyed in soft colors, saffron, pale rose, or light sky blue, were chosen not for comfort, but for symbolism. These colors suggested delicacy, innocence, and beauty. But there was another reason. For the light fabric, it revealed the body beneath without fully exposing it, creating a constant visual reminder of the concubine's availability. Sometimes these garments were perfumed before being worn, so that the boy carried the master's favorite scent wherever he walked, leaving traces of his role in the air like invisible signatures. Meals were carefully prepared, portioned not for nutrition, but for appearance. Concubines were fed delicacies designed to maintain soft skin and gentle curves. Honey-dipped figs, almonds, goat cheese mixed with rosewater. Meat was limited too. Prevent the building of muscle, which might spoil the desired form. Certain herbs, like fennel and anise, were added to meals to prevent the development of adult features too soon. In some cases, if a concubine showed signs of maturing faster than his master wished, he might be given special infusions designed to slow his growth, herbal concoctions that dulled the voice, slowed the beard, and kept the body in an in-between state for as long as possible. During the day, the concubine had roles beyond the bedroom. He was trained in music, playing the lyre or the flute, singing softly in corners of the household to entertain guests or soothe his master's moods. He learned poetry, memorizing verses not for personal expression, but to recite them on command, like a living library. Some concubines were taught to dance, not in public theaters, but in private rooms, where the movements were designed to please the eyes of select audiences. Every gesture, every step, was choreographed to reflect elegance and submission. The concubine's role extended into religious life as well. In certain households, boys were brought along to temple offerings, presented as symbols of the masters, wealth, and refinement. During festivals like the Dionysia, some concubines participated in rituals where their beauty was paraded through the streets, though their eyes were often lowered and their smiles controlled. They were praised publicly, but privately reminded that this adoration was conditional, temporary, and fragile. The fear of aging was a constant undercurrent in the concubine's mind. Each day brought the subtle terror of noticing a new line on the face, a shift in the voice, a change in the way the master looked at him. There was no retirement plan, no graceful exit. When the time came, and it always came, the boy's role would shift. For some, this meant being sold to another household, perhaps to a man less wealthy, less kind, or less restrained. For others, it meant being married off to a lower status woman, a way to remove him from elite circles while pretending to offer a reward. But many were simply cast out. There are records of former concubines seen wandering the outskirts of Athens, their once cherished faces no longer recognized, offering lessons in music for food or selling love in the shadows of the Agra. Some fell into religious cults, joining the itinerant groups of mendicants who roamed from city to city, their past, lives erased but not forgotten. Others became actors in traveling troupes, performing tragedies where their own experiences gave them a haunting realism. But perhaps the most painful fate of all was for those who remained in the household, no longer touched, but still present. They became part of the furniture of memory, moving silently in the background, assisting with the training of new concubines, teaching them the rituals, the scripts, the precise way to smile without joy. These older boys carried the ghost of their past roles in every step, shadows of their former beauty lingering like dust on forgotten statues. And yet, despite all this, the system persisted. Greek society wrapped these horrors in the language of culture, refinement, and tradition. The philosophers argued that love between men and boys was a higher form of affection, a pathway to wisdom. But for the concubines, it was rarely about love. It was about survival, about playing a role so perfectly that it became indistinguishable from reality. Some historians believe this system taught the Greek elite how to control not just bodies, but time itself. By keeping concubines suspended in a state of endless youth artificial, enforced and maintained, they created an illusion of immortality. Their symposiums, their political deals, their household rituals were all soaked in this strange denial of aging and death. But time, as always, moved forward. The concubines aged, the masters died, and the system that seemed eternal eventually faded. Yet the echoes remain in art, in literature, in the very idea that beauty is something to be owned, controlled, and preserved beyond its natural limits. As you lie there now, breathing gently, drifting between sleep and wakefulness, consider the invisible hands of history pressing softly against your thoughts. The concubines of ancient Greece were not just side characters in someone else's story. They were the unseen architects of a society obsessed with perfection and control. And in the soft darkness of the night, their quiet presence lingers still, reminding us that behind every idealized image of the past, there is often a hidden cost, a human life lived in silence. Beneath the surface of memory, out in the long hush of ancient Greek nights, when the symposia dissolved into silence, and the last embers in the oil, lamps dimmed to faint glows, the male concubines remained awake, their minds tethered to the intricate patterns of survival. Their lives were not merely a string of isolated humiliations, but a daily choreography of quiet endurance. They moved through spaces designed for beauty, but laced with invisible traps, performing roles that blurred the line between ornament and instrument. Each day began again like a whispered ritual, with concubines stepping softly into their assigned scripts, careful never to let their real selves rise too close to the surface. Many of these boys, after years of service, developed coping mechanisms far more complex than their masters realized. They became masters of micro-expression, able to read a flicker of the eye, the tightening of a jaw, or the weight of a sigh to predict a master's mood before a word was spoken. This wasn't out of affection, it was self-defense. Some boys even created internal maps of their master's emotional landscapes, memorizing patterns. How a certain wine might make him tender one night, but violent another. How political stress tightened his grip. How personal failure might mean a beating, disguised as discipline. These details became survival tools, lodged in the concubine's mind like quiet prayers. In certain houses, concubines were required to serve not just one master, but entire families, moving between brothers, cousins, or visiting dignitaries, their availability a form of hospitality. This practice blurred ownership into something even more impersonal, making the boy less a companion and more a shared commodity. There are scattered writings from minor philosophers and domestic scribes who recorded these customs with chilling normalcy, noting how a well-trained concubine should present no resistance, display no preference, and offer no memory of one. Night to the next, to forget was part of the role, but the boys did not forget. Their memories became silent archives, stored deep behind smiles and lowered eyes. Some concubines learned to dissociate, to float above their own experiences, observing themselves as if from outside their bodies. Others developed what modern minds would recognize as ritualized compulsions, counting floor tiles, touching specific objects in sequence, breathing in patterned rhythms to maintain control. At night, after the duties were done and the lamps were extinguished, many concubines lay awake, staring into the darkness, replaying the day's events not as memories, but as codes deciphering them for signs of change, danger, or opportunity. Some boys whispered to the gods of sleep, not for rest, but for escape. Hypnos, the god of sleep, and Thanatos, his twin brother, the god of death, became symbols of comfort, not because the boys wished to die, but because in sleep and death, there was finally no expectation to perform. Among the most curious and cruel customs was the ritual of the mirror. In certain wealthy homes, concubines were made to sit before polished bronze mirrors each morning and repeat affirmations scripted by their masters. I am beautiful because he desires me, or I exist to bring pleasure and calm. These mantras were recited not for the boy's benefit, but to reinforce his role as property. The mirror reflected not the boy's own identity, but the master's projection, a reflection of someone else's control. Over time, the boys learned to disassociate from their reflections, seeing the face in the mirror not as self, but as a mask. Some concubines reported, in writings that survive only as fragments, a phenomenon where they no longer recognized their faces. They described the sensation of becoming invisible to themselves while remaining hypervisible to others, paradox that deepened the psychological fracture of their existence. This fracturing was not accidental. It was part of the system. Greek society, especially in the elite circles, was built on the careful maintenance of roles. The master was the philosopher, the citizen, the patriarch. A concubine was the reflection of his power, a living echo of his wealth and refinement. But when the echo became too sharp, when the concubine showed too much intelligence, too much awareness, the system responded with correction. Some boys were punished for learning too quickly, for showing curiosity about the world beyond their assigned tasks. There are records of concubines who were caught reading or writing skills they were often taught for performance purposes, but forbidden to use independently. These boys might have their writing materials confiscated, their lessons stopped, or worse, their hands punished physically, fingers bound or burned to discourage further learning. This control extended to language itself. In some households, concubines were instructed to limit their vocabulary to soft, pleasing words, avoiding harsh consonants or political terms. Their speech became a curated performance, their voices trained not just in pitch, but in content, censored to remove anything that might suggest agency or intellect. And yet, behind closed eyes, these boys thought in full sentences. They carried entire worlds in their minds, memories of families left behind, of native languages replaced by Greek, of dreams that had no place in their daily existence. Some secretly composed poetry, not written but memorized internally, creating verses they would never speak aloud, storing them in the folds of memory as a private refuge. There were moments of connection between concubines, brief windows of solidarity in the quiet hours. In shared quarters, when the masters slept and the house fell into stillness, the boys sometimes whispered to one another, sharing stories, advice, or simply presence. These conversations were dangerous. If overheard, they could be punished as conspiracies. But the need for human connection often overrode fear. In these stolen moments, they might exchange knowledge about which herbs could soothe the stomach after too much wine, how to feign sleep convincingly, or how to calm the breath when fear threatened to overwhelm the body. Some even whispered old stories from their homeland's myths and legends, not of Greek heroes, but of their ancestors, keeping fragments of lost cultures alive beneath the dominant narrative of Greek superiority. There are mentions in surviving texts of concubines creating secret games, small patterns of tapping fingers or blinking eyes to communicate during banquets without being noticed. These nonverbal codes allowed them to express humor, warning, or sympathy across a crowded room, offering tiny moments of agency within the confines of servitude. But these networks were fragile. Trust was risky. A concubine who betrayed another could gain favor with the master, creating a culture of quiet paranoia that sometimes shattered bonds between boys. Masters exploited this, sometimes intentionally, setting concubines against one another to prevent unity. They knew that isolation made control easier. Over time, some boys internalized the system so deeply that they could not imagine life beyond it. Even when freedom was offered rare, as it was, it came with its form of terror. What does a life look like when you have spent your formative years as someone else's possession? Many former concubines found themselves lost in the wider world, unable to form relationships, mistrusting of kindness, forever trapped in the patterns of performance and submission they had been forced to learn. Some sought out other concubines who had aged out of service, forming quiet communities on the fringes of cities, living together in small clusters, sharing food and stories, offering one another the comfort of shared history. Others wandered, alone, slipping into roles as temple servants, mourners for hire, or keepers of graves jobs that required silence and presence but no personal expression. A few became healers, using the knowledge they had secretly collected during their years. In elite households, treating the wounds of other outcasts, sharing herbal remedies they were never supposed to know. And then some disappeared entirely, their names and faces lost to time, their existence remembered only as footnotes in household records or as nameless figures in faded frescoes. As you lie quietly now, letting your breath slow and your thoughts drift, imagine the countless concubines who moved through history like shadows, present in every grand house, every symposium, every political alliance, yet never acknowledged as full participants in the story. Their lives were woven into the foundation of Greek society, but their voices were erased, their experiences silenced. And yet, in this moment of reflection, they are remembered not as objects of beauty, but as people who endured, who adapted, who survived in the smallest, most human ways. Their stories, soft and hidden, still linger in the quiet spaces of history, waiting patiently beneath the grand narratives, whispering back at last dot in the deepest hours of ancient Greek nights, when the wind along the Aegean coast whispered. Through stone colonnades, the male concubines of wealthy households lay still in their assigned spaces, eyes half open, minds never fully at rest. For them, the boundary between waking life and dreams was thin, not because they drifted easily into sleep, but because the reality was already a kind of half-dream, a controlled performance of beauty and compliance, where their own needs dissolved beneath the weight of others' desires. Imagine now the texture of those nights, the coldness of marble beneath bare feet, the faint fragrance of burnt myrrh still lingering in the air from the evening's rituals. In the grand villas of Athens, Corinth, or Rhodes, silence was not an absence of sound. It was a design, carefully maintained by those who lived within it. The concubines were part of this silence, moving through rooms as quietly as possible, their presence meant to be felt like a warm breeze, soft and unthreatening. Their training included not just physical grace, but emotional suppression. From an early age, they were taught to manage not only their posture, but their reactions, to conceal pain with gentle smiles, to turn tears into stillness, to transform fear into service. There were techniques passed down quietly between older and younger concubines, lessons not written, but learned through shared glances in dim corridors. One method involved focusing on a single point in the room, a crack in the wall, a flickering lamp flame, and breathing deeply into the chest without letting the shoulders move. This allowed the boy to appear calm, even when his heart raced. beneath the surface. Another technique was to recite lines of poetry silently in the mind during moments of distress, using meter and rhythm as anchors to stay grounded while enduring whatever the master demanded. These were survival skills, crafted in spaces where escape was not an option. And there were many such moments when the body remained still, but the mind traveled far away. Some concubines imagined themselves as rivers, flowing beyond the walls of the house, slipping past the city boundaries, disappearing into the vastness of the sea. Others thought of the stars, distant and unreachable, their light cold and eternal compared to the brief, painful flashes of human life. But the night was not always quiet. There were times when the master's summons would come softly, a finger tapping against a cup, a subtle cough, a whispered name in the dark. And the concubine would rise, without hesitation, crossing the room in perfect silence, knowing exactly how to arrange his features, his limbs, his voice. His body was not his own. It was a vessel for another's comfort, another's projection of power and control. These visits were part of the system, as predictable as the phases of the moon. Some masters preferred conversation, using the concubine as a confidant in the stillness of the night. They would whisper secrets of politics, war, or forbidden love, knowing the boy could not repeat them. In these moments, the concubine became not just an object of pleasure, but a keeper of dangerous knowledge, burdened with truths that could destroy lives if spoken aloud. The weight of these secrets added another layer to the concubine's role, another reason for silence, another cause for sleeplessness. And yet, in the morning, life resumed as if the night had not happened. The concubines rose before the household, assisting in preparations for the new day. They helped arrange robes and sandals, prepared scented oils for the master's bath, and stood quietly in corners while plans were made for politics and business. Their plans did not exist. Their futures were shaped entirely by the whims of others. Some concubines tried to create small moments of control in their daily routines. When tasked with tending to the household shrine, they might linger for an extra breath before the statues of the gods, whispering private prayers not for favor, but for invisibility, for the power to be unseen, to pass through the day without incident, to survive unnoticed. Others took solace in caring for animals, feeding birds, or tending to garden turtles, small acts of kindness that required no performance, no masking of self. But the tension never fully left. Even in the garden, even while feeding a sparrow from the palm of a hand, the concubine knew he might be called back at any moment. The house owned every part of his time. There was no refuge from service. As the day wore on, the concubine's responsibilities shifted again. During symposiums, he became part of the decor of social power. He poured wine with careful precision, making sure the ratio of water to wine was perfect according to each guest's preference. He listened to conversations about philosophy, war, commerce, and poetry, absorbing the words without reacting, even when the topics turned to himself, when the guests commented openly on his appearance, on his posture, on the way his hands moved. It was not unusual for the concubine to become the focus of wagers or jokes, his life treated as a game piece on the table alongside dice and drinking cups. Some guests would argue over which boy in the household was the most beautiful, the most compliant, the most entertaining. The concubine learned to smile at these discussions, to participate with soft laughter, though inside he kept count of the humiliations like tally marks in his mind. And there were always new rituals. Some masters believed in purification ceremonies, designed to renew the concubine's energy after a night of service. These involved cold baths at dawn, followed by anointing with oils mixed with crushed pearls or rare herbs, as if to wash away the previous day's interactions and reset the boy as a fresh canvas for new desires. In some cases, this was literal. Certain elite families commissioned artists to paint images of their concubines on walls or pottery, freezing their beauty in time. But these images were often idealized, airbrushed versions of reality. The concubines depicted in art were always smiling, always graceful, always serene. The real boys, meanwhile, carried bruises, scars, and the invisible wounds of a life lived under constant surveillance. There are rare moments recorded in history where concubines resisted not openly, not dramatically, but in small, quiet ways. A boy might forget a line of memorized poetry on purpose, forcing a pause in the evening's performance. Another might feign illness to delay a summons, risking punishment for a moment of rest. These acts were dangerous, but sometimes necessary, for sanity. And yet, the system rarely allowed true rebellion. The structure of Greek household life was designed to prevent escape, both physically and mentally. Concubines were often foreigners, taken from conquered lands or sold by desperate families, cut off from their native languages, their birth names erased, replaced with new identities chosen by their owners. This stripping of origin made it difficult to imagine a life outside the walls of the house. Some boys even forgot the sound of their original dialects, their tongues reshaped by years of enforced Greek speech, their memories of home fading into dreams. In the rare event that a concubine was granted freedom, it often came with conditions. He might be given a small sum of money, a token acknowledgement of service, but no social standing. The path forward was uncertain. Some became artists or musicians, but their past roles clung to them like invisible chains. Others became courtesans or advisors to new masters, repeating the cycle in slightly different forms. And yet, despite all of this, the concubines of ancient Greece maintained a quiet resilience. They carried their histories in their bodies, in the tilt of a head, in the measured steps across mosaic floors, in the whispered prayers to unknown gods. They survived not just in the literal sense, but in the way they held onto fragments of selfhood, tiny private sanctuaries within the mind where no master could reach. As you breathe now, your own body relaxed, perhaps drifting toward sleep, think of the layers of history that lie beneath the grand stories of ancient civilizations. Think of the boys who served in silence, who poured wine, played music, and smiled on command while hiding whole worlds behind their eyes. Their stories were never meant to be told. And yet, in this moment, as the night stretches long and soft, their echoes reach you still soft as breath, fragile as memory, present in the spaces between history's louder voices, the hour between. Midnight and dawn was the loneliest time for a male concubine in ancient Greece. It was during this hour, when the last echoes of the symposium faded and the household grew silent, that the mind wandered to places the body could not follow, lying quietly on a woven mat at the foot of a master's bed or in a small corner. Of the andron, the concubine stared into the dark, where the outlines of statues and pottery blurred into shadows. Sleep, for them, was not a refuge. It was a dangerous state to drift into without permission. They learned to sleep lightly, one ear always tuned to the softest sound, the shift of silk robes, the creak of a couch, the sharp intake of a master's breath, signaling a new command. There was no locking of doors, no safe space of their own. Even the walls around them felt like breathing entities, as if the house itself was alive with the weight of rituals and expectations. For these boys, the night was a cycle of listening, of waiting, of performing stillness. In some households, the concubine was expected to remain awake through the entire night, watching over the master's sleep, ready to bring water or adjust the covers at a single whispered word. In others, they lay beside their master, not as lovers in mutual trust, but as objects of possession, their warmth another luxury. Like the soft fleece of imported wool or the glow of foreign bronze mirrors. To be wanted was survival. But to be, too wanted could become a different kind of prison. The concubine existed within this fragile balance between desire and danger, always aware that his role could shift in an instant from cherished companion to disposable object, from favored beauty to forgotten ornament. Some boys tried to navigate this world by becoming perfect mirrors, reflecting whatever the master wished to see. If the master was philosophical, the concubine became thoughtful, asking gentle questions about virtue and fate. If the master was cruel, the boy became stiller, quieter, shrinking himself into invisibility. If the master was melancholic, the concubine learned to sing softly in the night, using lullabies meant for children to calm a grown man's sorrow. But beneath these performances, a private self endured silent, watchful, recording everything. Each boy carried his secret map of survival, a personal codebook of gestures and silences, of risks taken and risks avoided. Some concubines developed complex relationships with the household slaves who served alongside them. These bonds were not always based on friendship. They were fragile alliances, woven out of necessity. A kitchen slave might slip an extra fig, or a slice of goat cheese into the concubine's meal, a tiny kindness that cost nothing but meant everything. A bath attendant might whisper warnings about the master's mood that day, sharing small bits of information that helped the boy prepare for the night ahead. But these alliances could not be trusted entirely. The slaves were also bound to the master's will, and betrayal was always a possibility. There were instances when a concubine's smallest secret, a glance, a sigh, a whispered wish, was reported back to the master as a form of currency, traded for favor or protection. And so the boys learned to trust sparingly, if at all. Isolation was safer, even if it meant carrying the full weight of fear alone. In the daytime, the concubine's duties continued in rigid patterns. He was often paraded through social gatherings, presented like a rare artifact alongside silverware and imported spices. Wealthy guests admired his posture, his obedience, his carefully trained responses. He learned to answer questions in precisely the right tone, not too bold, not too hesitant. His speech was monitored, curated by years of practice. If a guest asked about the weather, he replied with a poetic metaphor. If asked about his homeland, a land he barely remembered, he recited the master's preferred version of his origin story, not the truth, but the one designed for entertainment. His real memories remained hidden beneath the surface, like artifacts buried under layers of stone. Sometimes, during the quieter moments between performances, the concubine was tasked with preparing the master's items, arranging rings and signet seals, polishing the hilt of a ceremonial dagger, folding garments in a particular sequence that signified order and respect. These acts were not merely chores. They were rituals of subservience, reinforcing the hierarchy with every repetition. But within the privacy of these tasks, the boy found rare moments of reflection. Handling the master's possessions, he touched objects of immense value: gold, ivory, rare stones, yet he was considered lesser than these materials. He was both, more precious and less valued, more desired yet less autonomous. Some concubines developed small private games to cope with this paradox. As they polished a ring or arranged a cloak, they imagined themselves as invisible hands of fate, turning the wheel of destiny in secret ways. Others whispered ancient charms to themselves, phrases from old women in their childhood villages, meant to ward off evil or bring strength. These private thoughts became talismans of survival, hidden within the polished surfaces of daily tasks. There were also the darker rituals. In some houses, the concubine was subjected to medical examinations by household physicians, not for health, but for preservation. The master wanted to ensure the boy's beauty remained intact. If a blemish appeared, ointments were applied. If a limb was bruised, remedies were rushed to prevent marks. Some physicians administered special diets or herbal concoctions meant to slow growth, to delay maturity, to preserve the concubine in a state of soft, perpetual adolescence. These interventions were often dangerous, causing nausea, weakness, or long-term harm to the body. But the goal was not wellness, it was maintenance of aesthetic perfection. And through it all, the concubine learned not to resist. Resistance meant punishment. There were different forms of correction: isolation, verbal shaming, and denial of food or rest. In severe cases, boys were beaten not with rage, but with cold precision, as if their bodies were instruments needing recalibration. The concubine's survival depended on interpreting the smallest shifts in the household's mood. A master's bad day at the Senate could mean cruelty at night. A failed business deal might lead to harsher treatment. The boy became an emotional barometer, reading signs, adjusting behavior moment by moment. And yet, despite this constant calculation, there were moments when the system failed, when the concubine's mask slipped. Perhaps it was a glance held too long, a whispered word overheard, a tear not fully hidden. These slips were dangerous, but they were human. Some masters ignored them, others punished them, but all remembered them. The concubine was not allowed to make mistakes. His role was to be perfect always. But perfection, as the boys learned, was an impossible standard. Over time, the strain showed. Some concubines developed nervous conditions, described in ancient texts as body tremors of the soul. Their hands shook when lifting cups, and their eyes darted in unnatural ways. The household physicians prescribed poppy extract, but the root cause was never addressed. The boys lived in a state of constant hypervigilance, their bodies bearing the weight of invisible trauma. And yet, they endured. They survived. They adapted in ways unseen by their masters, holding on to small fragments of self within the vast machinery of service. As you rest now, in the comfort of your own space, think of those long-forgotten nights in marble chambers, where boys lay awake listening for the sound of footsteps, waiting for commands, crafting secret worlds inside their minds just to make it through another day. Their lives were quiet revolutions, battles fought without swords, victories measured not in escape, but in endurance. And though history recorded their masters' names, the concubine's echoes remain soft, persistent, woven into the spaces between the words, waiting in the quiet for someone to finally listen. The hours before dawn are often the most fragile, the most stretched between exhaustion and dread. For male concubines in ancient Greece, those hours held a weight far heavier than their delicate appearances suggested. They lay curled in corners of grand villas or at the foot of massive cedar beds, their bodies still, but their minds flooded with layers of memory and anticipation. They had learned, over the years of their captivity, how to exist in these in-between states, awake yet pretending to sleep, breathing softly so as not to disturb, eyes closed but senses sharpened to the subtlest shift in the room's air. The terracotta oil lamps, low burning through the night, cast gentle shapes against walls painted with scenes of gods and heroes, images of Heracles' labors, or of Apollo strumming his lyre. But for the concubine, those painted myths were far away, irrelevant. The boy's reality was not a heroic epic, but a delicate performance of survival, a continuous balancing act between appearing pleasing and remaining invisible. Some concubines developed the habit of counting breaths to lull themselves into a controlled calm. They would inhale slowly, exhale even slower, matching the rhythm of their master's breathing. This mimicry helped them anticipate mood shifts, knowing when the master stirred in restless sleep or when he shifted toward waking with a mind already calculating the next day's demands. The first words spoken to the master in the morning had to be perfect, soft in tone, respectful, but not fearful. A single misstep a word spoken too early, a hesitation too long, could set the mood for the entire day. And so the concubine rehearsed, over and over, silent scripts written in the theater of his mind. Did you rest well, master? Shall I first prepare the bath, master? These phrases were whispered into the morning air, rehearsed before dawn, so that when the master's eyes finally opened, there would be no faltering. After the first greeting, the concubine's day unfolded like a ritualistic pattern. He would assist in preparing the master's bath, mixing warm water with special herbs, bay leaves, lavender, sometimes crushed sage if the master believed in its power to ward off illness. The boy's hands, though soft and small, carried out these tasks with precision, knowing that the slightest mistake, a bath too cold, a towel folded incorrectly, could lead to punishment. But there was an unspoken rule among concubines: never show the bruises. If a concubine bore marks from the previous night's anger or pleasure, he would carefully hide them beneath linen wraps or strategically placed oils. Beauty was not just expected, it was mandatory. Even suffering had to be beautiful. In some households, the master required his concubine to recite poetry during these morning rituals. The boy's voice had to remain steady, melodic, never betraying exhaustion or emotion. He would speak lines from Homer or Sappho, phrases that praised love, loyalty, and devotion, ironies that twisted inside his throat as he said them. There were moments when the concubine wondered if the masters noticed the cruelty beneath the beauty of these recitations, or if they truly believed in the fictions they constructed about love and power. But such thoughts had to be suppressed quickly. Questioning the system, even silently, could lead to mistakes, and mistakes could lead to pain. The day's duties continued without pause. The concubine was often tasked with managing the master's clothing, selecting the proper tunic for the day, folding the fabric with precise angles, and ensuring the sash was tied in a way that signaled status but not arrogance. In the Greek elite, even clothing carried political meaning, and the concubine learned to navigate these symbols as carefully as he navigated conversations. Some concubines were also responsible for arranging the master's jewelry, signet rings, chains of silver or gold, amulets against envy. These objects, cold in the morning air, pressed into the concubine's hands as he prepared them, reminders of the wealth he served but could never own. Occasionally, a concubine was called to accompany his master into public spaces. In these moments, the boy walked 2 steps behind, eyes lowered, movements graceful but unobtrusive. The city streets were filled with merchants, philosophers, and common citizens, but the concubine was trained not to look at them directly. His world existed in the narrow channel of his master's shadow. Sometimes strangers would glance at him with curiosity or pity, but more often they looked at him as one would admire a sculpture, beautiful, distant, untouchable. But in the concubine's mind, each walk through the city was a quiet agony. He might pass a temple. He was never allowed to enter freely. A market stall selling figs and olives he would never buy with his coin. A family embracing in the street. Mother brushing her son's hair back from his forehead. A gesture so simple and so impossible for the concubine to receive. These moments planted seeds of longing deep inside him, but longing was dangerous. He learned to bury it beneath layers of practiced stillness. When the master met with other elites, the concubine's role shifted again. He became a silent attendant at private meetings, pouring wine, adjusting the position of cushions, and standing perfectly still for hours. In these settings, the boy was invisible yet constantly observed. His beauty was part of the rooms. Decor, a sign of the master's refinement, but he was not allowed to contribute thoughts or opinions. His intelligence existed only as a tool for service memorizing who drank how much, who whispered to whom, who laughed too loudly at which. Joke. The concubine became a walking archive of subtle political shifts, but his knowledge remained locked inside, unspoken. In the rare moments when guests left and the household quieted again, the concubine was sometimes given a brief time alone. These moments were not for rest, but for preparation. He would check his reflection in polished bronze, adjusting his appearance to ensure it met expectations. He would clean the master's cups and robes, sometimes humming softly under his breath, not for joy, but to keep his mind anchored in routine. Some boys, during these moments, whispered prayers to lesser-known gods, not the grand Olympians, but the quiet deities of thresholds and shadows. They asked for small favors, that tonight would be easier than last night, that the master's mood would be gentle, but their bodies would not betray them with trembling or tears. And yet, even in these moments of solitude, the concubine was never truly alone. The house watched, other servants watched. The walls, covered in painted myths of gods and heroes, seemed to watch too. The concubine's life was a performance with no audience, but everyone. When night returned, the cycle began again. The boy prepared the master's bed, smoothing the linens, adjusting the pillows. He set out the oils for the evening's rituals, the perfumes that signaled the transition from day to night. Sometimes, the master would gesture softly, a small flick of the fingers, and the concubine would know exactly what that meant, when to speak, when to be silent, when to follow, when to serve. There were no surprises. And yet, every night held a new form of exhaustion, a new layer of silence wrapped over the old one. As you rest now, letting your breath soften, imagine the quiet echoes of those lives' boys who moved through marble rooms like shadows, whose names were not recorded, whose stories faded into the spaces between history's louder voices. They carried entire worlds inside themselves, unspoken and unseen, surviving not by force, but by grace under constant pressure. Their lives were the soft machinery beneath the polished surface of Greek civilization. And though they were told they would be forgotten, their echoes remain, lingering still in the quiet moments between sleep and waking, where the mind wanders and the walls remember dot in the quiet folds of the ancient Greek night, long after this last amphora of wine had been emptied, and the symposium guests had stumbled into sleep. The household's concubines remained awake, wrapped in the soft fabric of their roles, but never truly resting. Part of them stayed alert, trained to listen for the subtlest sound, a master's sigh in the dark, the scrape of sandals against stone, the sudden call of their name whispered across a room heavy with midnight silence. For the male concubine, the role did not end when the lamps were extinguished. Night was not a break from service. It was an extension of it, an intimate theater where the stakes were higher, where beauty became a currency traded in shadows and breath. Each concubine lived under a constant expectation to be available, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually, silently prepared for whatever the master desired. Some nights were spent in soft conversation, where the boy was expected to listen to philosophical musings, to nod at carefully constructed ideas about virtue and ethics, all while knowing that his existence contradicted those very ideals. Other nights were heavier, filled with unspoken needs the master dared not confess to anyone but his concubine. The boy was a vessel for confession, a silent wall against which thoughts were thrown, secrets of affairs, political betrayals, desires, forbidden by the city's laws. These words, spoken in hushed tones beneath silk covers, were never acknowledged the next day. The concubine absorbed them, stored them like invisible scars, knowing that to repeat them meant death, and to forget them meant vulnerability. So they carried the words carefully, balanced like wine cups, fragile and spilling easily if the mind wandered too far. There were rituals for managing this burden, quiet methods the concubines developed on their own. Some would tap their fingers in specific sequences against the bedding, a pattern known only to themselves, to calm the rising panic that came from knowing too much. Others would recite ancient names from their homelands in their heads, recalling places they had not seen. Since childhood, creating mental maps of rivers, mountains, and village squares they would likely never visit again. These small acts of personal memory became lifelines, invisible threads connecting them to something beyond the house, beyond the master's reach. The concubine's body was constantly monitored, both by the household and by himself. Each morning, he checked his reflection in polished bronze, searching for signs of change. A wrinkle, a shadow beneath the eyes, a shift in posture. These were dangers, markers of fading beauty. The Greek system of concubinage was ruthless about age. Youth was currency, and time was the silent thief. Some boys tried to slow the clock through herbs, applying salves learned from older slaves, mixing honey with crushed rose petals to keep their skin soft, massaging oil into their joints to prevent stiffness that might betray their years of service. But time moved forward regardless. The fear of being replaced lived under every breath. In larger households, new boys arrived regularly, fresh faces brought from distant lands, purchased in markets where the price of a body was debated alongside olives and goats. The older concubines watched these arrivals with mixed emotions. Relief that for now, the master's attention might shift elsewhere, but also dread, knowing that this meant they were one step closer to disposal. Some tried to mentor the new boys, teaching them the soft arts of survival, how to hold a gaze for just the right amount of time, how to bow without seeming servile, how to anticipate a master's needs before he spoke them. This mentorship was not kindness for kindness's sake. It was a way of controlling the household hierarchy, a method of maintaining balance in a system where the rules were unwritten but harshly enforced. But the masters understood this too. They sometimes played concubines against each other, fostering rivalries to prevent solidarity. If the boys were busy managing competition, they were less likely to think about rebellion. The household became a quiet battlefield of social maneuvering, where smiles masked strategies and small privileges were guarded fiercely. A glance from the master could create alliances or spark feuds. Access to better food, a softer sleeping, mat, or permission to leave the house for errands. These became tokens of favor, traded and envied. In some cases, concubines were sent on special errands beyond the household walls, not because the master trusted them fully, but because certain tasks required discretion. A concubine might deliver secret letters, carrying messages between political allies or rivals. Sometimes he was asked to pick up rare perfumes or exotic spices, but other times, the errands involved more dangerous deliveries, pouches of herbs meant for abortions, or whispered instructions for silent bribes. These moments outside the house were rare glimpses of another world, but they came with their risks. The concubine knew that if anything went wrong, he would bear the blame, regardless of who had ordered the task. Even outside the household, he was never free. City streets were not safer than the master's chamber. In public, the concubine faced another layer of performance. Strangers might look at him with desire, envy, or contempt. Some whispered insults as he passed, accusing him of corrupting morals, of weakening the state. Others tried to touch him, testing his boundaries in markets or on temple steps, knowing he could not protest without risking punishment later. And so he moved through public spaces like a ghost, present but untouchable, seen but unheard. Some boys learned to make themselves invisible in crowds, adopting a neutral face, a soft gaze that deflected attention without seeming rude. They mastered the art of passing unnoticed, of blending into the marble and dust of the city. Back in the household, the concubine resumed his daily roles, adjusting his performance depending on who was watching. For visiting philosophers, he became a silent student, pouring wine while absorbing lessons about ethics he could never apply to his own life. For wives and daughters of the house, he became a harmless companion, playing the lyre or reciting poetry, careful never to cross the delicate line of propriety. With other household slaves, he navigated the tension between shared suffering and social difference. As a concubine, he held a strange position, both privileged and powerless. He had access to rooms where ordinary slaves could not go, but he was also more closely controlled, his body considered part of the master's domain. It was no true solidarity. The system divided everyone into roles that kept them isolated, suspicious and compliant. Some concubines dreamed of escape, but few tried. Those who did rarely succeeded. The Greek world was tightly networked, and a runaway concubine had nowhere to hide. Without legal rights, he could not seek protection. Without family ties, he had no one to turn to. And so most stayed, performing their roles day after day, night after night, crafting small rituals of endurance to survive. Some found solace in the rhythm of music, the quiet repetition of plucking lyre strings when no one was listening. Others focused on sensory details, the feel of smooth linen under their fingers, the scent of olive oil in the air, the sound of distant waves breaking against stone walls, small, grounding moments that reminded them they were still alive. At night, as the household settled into sleep again, the concubine returned to his place near the master's bed or in the cold chamber reserved for his rest. His body relaxed by habit, but his mind stayed awake, counting the hours until morning, mapping the patterns of the house, rehearsing tomorrow's tasks in his head. As you lie still now, your breath slowing in the quiet, imagine the layers of history beneath the polished surface of ancient Greece. Beneath the temples and philosophies, beneath the marble statues and poetic verses, there were lives like this, soft, controlled, often forgotten. Boys who learned to endure, not by fighting, but by flowing around the obstacles placed before them, like water moving quietly through stone corridors. Their stories did not survive in scrolls or songs, but they are still there, lingering in the air, quiet between breaths, waiting in the dark, reminding us that history is not only what is written, it is also what is endured in silence, in the deep quiet of the night. When the marble floors of wealthy Greek homes cooled beneath the fading heat of the day, the concubine lay still, his breathing controlled, his body curved softly into the woven mat that served as his resting place. But true rest never came. Sleep was something he approached cautiously, like a cautious animal testing the air before leaving its shelter. His mind hovered in that thin space between awareness and surrender, trained over years to remain alert, even when his eyes closed. He listened to the subtle creaks of the house-wooden beams shifting, a distant door latch sliding, the faint hum of insects just beyond the window shutters. Every sound could mean something. Every sound could mean nothing. And in the space between those possibilities, the concubine lived his life. In the grand mosaic of ancient Greek society, the concubine was a carefully hidden piece, placed in the background, never meant to take center stage. Yet his role touched nearly every layer of elite life. Behind the public displays of democracy, behind the philosophical debates about virtue and reason, behind the paintings of heroes and gods, there existed this softer, quieter, and more fragile system, a world of beauty maintained through constant control, a world where the concubine existed as both person and possession. Some boys, especially those who served in houses of senators and generals, were given additional responsibilities beyond their physical service. They were trained to monitor the household's mood, to memorize who visited and when, to silently note the small political conversations overheard during private dinners. In this way, the concubine became a living diary, a memory keeper who recorded everything but spoke nothing. Their knowledge became heavy, layered over months and years, a private collection of observations about the elite secrets no other servant was allowed to know. And yet, for the concubine, this knowledge brought no power. It was a dangerous gift, one that could never be used, one that could only be carried in silence. Some masters grew attached to their concubines, confusing possession with affection. They whispered promises in the dark pledges that they would never replace the boy, that they would offer freedom when the time was right, that they saw him as more than property. But the concubine knew better. He had seen others before him make the same mistake, to believe a master's midnight whispers. In the light of day, those promises faded, replaced by the cold machinery of status and reputation. Masters had wives, political alliances, and social obligations that overruled private sentiment. And so the concubine learned to nod softly when promises were spoken, offering the perfect expression of gratitude without ever believing a word. In some rare cases, the master's wife acknowledged the concubine directly. There were households where the wife accepted the boy's role as part of the household's functioning another ornament, like the fine tapestries from Persia or the bronze lamps from Egypt. She might even request the boy's presence during her social gatherings, asking him to play music or recite poetry for her friends. In these moments, the concubine had to walk an impossibly thin line, offering charm without flirtation, beauty without threat. The mistress of the house wielded her power, and the concubine who overstepped accidentally or otherwise could find himself punished not just by the master, but by the entire household. The wife could arrange for the boy's removal, send him to another city, or reduce him to the status of a field laborer. And so the concubine performed carefully, maintaining neutrality, offering the softness of beauty, while never stepping beyond the boundaries set for him. The fear of replacement never left. In every household, the concubine knew that somewhere, in the markets of Athens or Delos, in the slave pens of Corinth, younger boys were being trained, groomed for purchase. Their bodies oiled, their hair curled, their voices softened by instructors who specialized in preparing them for this very role. The concubine imagined these boys sometimes, late at night, wondering if one of them would soon take his place. He wondered whether he would be discarded quietly, given to another household, or left to fend for himself in the alleys near the Agra. Some boys were sent to rural estates, assigned to manage household accounts or teach younger servants. But even there, the shadow of their past followed them. In the villages, people whispered about former concubines' men who had once been beautiful, now reduced to administrators or scribes, their eyes hollow, their hands trembling when touched unexpectedly. Others disappeared altogether, swallowed by the sea of forgotten lives that history leaves behind. There were few avenues for escape. Some concubines, when they sensed their usefulness waning, sought refuge in temples, pledging themselves to gods as ritual servants. In sanctuaries dedicated to Cybele or Dionysus, where social roles blurred and hierarchy softened, they found reprieve. But even there, they carried the echoes of their previous lives. Some became male priestesses, performing ecstatic dances, wearing ceremonial robes that masked their identities. But the past remained etched into their bodies, into the way they moved, into the way they lowered their eyes when addressed by men of power. A few concubines managed to accumulate small amounts of wealth, saving bits of coin given as rewards, or tips by guests at banquets. This secret stash was sometimes hidden under floor tiles, sewn into the lining of garments, or buried in garden corners. It was not enough to buy freedom, but it was enough to dream. Perhaps one day they could buy passage on a ship, find a distant city where no one knew their past, and start again as a merchant or craftsman. These dreams lived quietly in the back of their minds, a soft rebellion against the total ownership their masters believed they had. But the world beyond the household was not kind to former concubines. Greek society loved beauty and youth, but it feared and despised those who reminded it of the cost of that beauty. A concubine who aged out of service became a discomforting figure, a reminder of the transaction, of the power imbalance, of the system itself. People looked away, changed the subject, pretended not to notice. The concubine understood this, and so he learned to make himself small, to blend into the background even after his formal duties ended. Some lived as shadows in their former households, helping to train new boys in the art of subtlety, teaching them how to survive without breaking, passing on the unspoken rules of endurance. They told the younger ones how to control their breath, how to hide their fear, how to become what the master wanted without losing the last fragments of self hidden deep inside. They never said these lessons aloud in full sentences. It was always shared in fragments, in glances, in moments of quiet between duties. This transmission of survival was their final act of care in a system that offered none in return. There were no written manuals for this life. No philosophers wrote dialogues about the internal experiences of concubines. Their thoughts, their dreams, their private terrors were not carved into stone or preserved on papyrus. But the concubines carried their histories in their bodies, in the way their hands moved, in the way they stepped softly across cold floors, in the way they woke instantly at the faintest sound. They carried the weight of silence with them every day. And as you rest now, allowing your breath to deepen, consider the quiet resilience of these forgotten lives. The concubines of ancient Greece were not merely ornaments of a wealthy society. They were the silent architects of its private world, the hidden figures whose endurance underpinned the rituals of luxury and status. They survived by becoming experts in softness, in stillness, in reading the air of a room more carefully than any philosopher read a scroll. Their lives were lived between the lines of history's grand narratives, but their presence was constant, real, and woven into the fabric of the past. And as you close your eyes tonight, let their stories settle gently into your mind, not as tragedies, but as echoes of human endurance in a world that preferred not to listen. In the fragile stillness just before dawn, the concubine adjusted his breathing once more, matching the rhythm of the master's sleep, careful not to disturb, a delicate boundary between presence and disappearance. His body lay motionless on the thin woven mat provided to him, yet his mind hovered somewhere between memory and calculation. This was not sleep, it was waiting, always waiting. In the grand homes of ancient Greece, where marble columns gleamed, softly in the moonlight, and perfumed air drifted lazily through open courtyards, the male concubine was both everywhere and nowhere, his existence fundamental to daily life, but carefully erased from public memory. His role was not acknowledged in the official records of politics or philosophy, but his presence underpinned the private rituals of the elite. He was the silent attendant, the polished adornment, the invisible listener who carried the emotional and physical burdens no citizen wished to name aloud. Each day began the same way, and yet each day carried its own set of unpredictable dangers. There were mornings when the master awoke in good spirits, brushing a hand lazily across the concubine's hair, offering a few murmured words of approval. On these days, the boy's tasks felt lighter, his movements more fluid, the weight of survival slightly less crushing. But other mornings brought a different air. A letter received from a rival, a political defeat in the assembly, or simply a restless, sleepless night could change everything. The master's mood became the concubine's weather, and he learned to forecast it before the first word was spoken. A furrow of the brow, a tension in the hands, the way the master sat up in bed, all clues to be read with the precision of an oracle interpreting omens. After the morning rituals, bathing the master, preparing clothes, arranging sandals, the concubine slipped into his daytime role, hovering in the background as the household came to life. Some boys were tasked with assisting in household accounts, learning to count coins and grain, and recording transactions in quiet scripts. Others managed inventories of wine, oil, and fabric, keeping track of the luxuries that defined the master's social standing. These tasks were performed not because the concubine was trusted, but because his proximity made him useful. He was part of the master's shadow, always present, always observing, but observation came at a cost. The concubine absorbed more than simple transactions. He learned the details of alliances, the whispered deals struck between powerful men, the cruel words spoken about rivals, friends, and even wives. This knowledge became a private burden, one he could not share with anyone. To speak would mean punishment. To forget was impossible. His mind became a vault, storing secrets without keys. Some concubines developed methods of managing this mental weight. They recited silent mantras, whispering prayers under their breath as they walked from room to room. Others constructed imaginary temples in their minds, places where they could lock away dangerous information behind the stone doors of memory, safe from accidental revelation. These internal landscapes became more real than the marble courtyards they swept or the perfumed rooms where they served wine. It was not just the master who watched the concubine, it was the entire household. Other slaves, servants, and attendants monitored his behavior, sometimes with envy, sometimes with suspicion. The concubine's position was both privileged and precarious. He had access to the master's private chambers, to the soft conversations of the night through the master's body and moods. But he also had no allies. His status made him different from the kitchen slaves or the field workers, yet he was still property, subject to the same rules of ownership and disposal. Some concubines found brief moments of comfort in the company of other boys who shared their role. In large households, it was not uncommon for several concubines to serve simultaneously, each rotating through the master's attention depending on his whims. These boys formed quiet bonds in stolen moments, during the washing of linens, while preparing perfumes, while waiting in the cold corners of the house for the next summons. They whispered advice to one another, teaching the younger boys how to hold a cup without trembling, how to kneel gracefully without revealing too much of their fear, how to answer difficult questions with gentle deflection. These shared lessons were not acts of rebellion, but of survival. They created a private language of endurance, a hidden curriculum passed from boy to boy beneath the master's gaze. But there were also dangers in these friendships. The household thrived on competition, and masters sometimes encouraged rivalries to maintain control. A boy who gained favor risked becoming the target of jealousy. A misplaced word, a reported mistake, could lead to punishment, reassignment, or worse. The concubine learned to keep his trust limited, his friendships careful, his alliances temporary. The concubine's body was both his tool and his prison. Each day he monitored himself for signs of change. A bruise from the previous night's grasp, a scratch from a jealous rival, a pimple on the skin, these were all threats to his status. He was expected to remain flawless, his beauty an ongoing performance. Some boys resorted to secret rituals to protect their appearance, using crushed herbs mixed with goat's milk to soothe the skin, applying oils late at night to prevent the dryness of winter air, and practicing soft stretches to keep the muscles pliant and elegant. But no ritual could stop the march of time. The concubine lived in fear of aging, knowing that his value diminished with each passing season. His voice deepening, his limbs thickening, these natural signs of growth became warnings of impending obsolescence. Some boys tried to slow this process by eating less, sleeping in specific positions to prevent the broadening of shoulders, and binding their waists to maintain softness in the body. These were not acts of vanity. They were survival strategies, desperate attempts to delay the moment when the master's gaze would shift permanently to someone younger. When a concubine reached the edge of usefulness, his fate varied. Some masters kept their boys as secretaries or house managers, transforming them from objects of desire into tools of administration. Others disposed of them quietly, giving them away as gifts to lesser households, or selling them back into the markets they had once been purchased from. In the worst cases, the concubine simply vanished, sent away to distant estates, or removed in the silent ways that Greek households managed. Inconvenient problems. There are whispered stories, unrecorded in official histories, of boys who were led into temple courtyards at night, offered as symbolic sacrifices not in death, but in removal from the social order. These boys disappeared into the spaces between public and private life, their names unspoken, their faces forgotten. For the few who survived into adulthood without being discarded, life was still complicated. They carried the marks of their past, not always on the skin, but deep within the mind. Some became wandering musicians or poets, using their skills to earn a living in taverns or at the edges of festivals. Others entered temples, becoming attendants of gods whose rites allowed for gender ambiguity and the mixing of roles. But most lived quietly, avoiding attention, knowing too well the dangers of being seen. The concubine's survival depended on mastery of invisibility, not disappearing, but learning how to be present without causing discomfort, how to serve without asserting, how to exist as a reflection of another's desire without allowing his self to surface. And yet, within this complex system of control, the concubine still dreamed. In the private moments before sleep, when the master's breathing slowed and the house grew still, the boy imagined different lives. Sometimes he pictured himself as a bird, flying over the rooftops of Athens, beyond the city walls, toward the sea. Other times, he imagined waking up in a world where no one owned his body, where his name was his own again, where his laughter did not have to be measured or planned. These dreams were small acts of resistance, invisible rebellions that no master could detect. They did not change the system, but they kept a part of the concubine alive beneath the layers of performance. As you lie there now, your breath softening into rest, think of these quiet lives. Think of the boys who learned to exist between roles, between silence and service, between ownership and endurance. Their stories are not carved into stone, but they exist in the soft echoes of history, in the spaces between words, in the breaths between sentences. They remind us that history is not only made by the powerful, it is also carried quietly by those who survived in the shadows. And in the hush of the night, their echoes remain, as real as any monument, as lasting as any poem out in the slow, shifting stillness of ancient Greek nights. The household eventually settled into patterns of breath and silence. The concubine, lying quietly in his small corner of the master's chambers or the cold stone recesses of the andron, let his body soften into the mat beneath him, but his mind never truly yielded to sleep. His role did not allow it. Even in the deepest hours of the night, his purpose continued to be present, to be accessible, to exist as a silent extension of another man's power. This was not simply servitude. It was something far more intricate, far more invisible. It was a life woven from quiet compliance, from the subtle art of adjusting oneself to fit perfectly into the contours of someone else's desire. The concubine learned early that his body was not his own. Every movement, every breath, every glance was part of a carefully controlled display. He could not shift his weight too suddenly in the night without risking waking the master. He could not sigh audibly. He could not tremble when called upon, even if his muscles ached from hours of stillness. The art of endurance was invisible to those who demanded it from him, but it consumed every part of his existence. Some concubines, over time, began to experience their bodies as separate from themselves. There are scattered fragments of personal accounts, phrases written secretly on wax tablets or whispered between boys when no one else could hear, describing the sensation of watching oneself from above, of floating just outside the skin, observing, as if detached. This was not madness. It was a protective mechanism, a way of surviving the constant erosion of personal will. During daylight, the concubine's duties became more public, but no less intimate. He was expected to manage the master's items, combs, oils, clothing, as if these objects were sacred. He polished silver mirrors until they reflected the flawless image of the man who owned him. He mixed perfumes in careful proportions, learning which scents suited the master's moods. Rose for days of politics, myrrh for nights of private indulgence, lavender for moments of grief. Each smell was tied to a ritual, and each ritual became a thread in the concubine's daily fabric. Some concubines were tasked with preparing not only the master's body, but his mind. They read poetry aloud while the master dined, soft verses designed to soothe or arouse. They sang, their voices trained not to overpower the room, but to slip beneath the master's thoughts, guiding him into the desired emotional state. These performances required precision. A misplaced note, a line of poetry spoken with too much feeling, could ruin the atmosphere and bring punishment. And yet, beneath this surface-level servitude, the concubine carried his private world. He collected bits of poetry for himself, lines he repeated silently, not for his master's pleasure, but for his comfort. Some boys composed secret poems that no one would ever hear, shaping metaphors in their minds as they folded robes or massaged oil into another man's skin. These small acts of creativity were lifelines, keeping a hidden self alive beneath the layers of expected behavior. In moments of solitude, rare as they were, some concubines practiced controlling their facial muscles in front of polished bronze. They trained their features to move just enough to seem natural, but not so much as to reveal inner life. They learned how to laugh softly without showing real joy, how to appear contemplative without actually thinking of anything dangerous, how to express affection without risking the consequences of real attachment. The mastery of this emotional disguise was as important as any physical beauty. For the concubine, beauty alone was not enough. It had to be accompanied by flawless performance. His presence was meant to soothe the master's ego, to reflect his desires, to absorb his insecurities without reflecting them outward. There were days when the master grew philosophical, speaking at length about love, friendship, and virtue. The concubine was expected to listen patiently, to nod at the appropriate moments, to ask gentle questions that allowed the master to continue his monologue uninterrupted. These were perhaps the strangest moments of all in the man who owned. The concubine spoke of the nature of love, while never acknowledging the contradiction of the boy's existence. The concubine's love was not asked for, only his attention. His body was used, his beauty maintained, but his heart was to remain silent. Some boys developed private relationships with the household gods, praying not to Zeus or Athena, but to lesser deities, the ones who ruled over doorways, thresholds, and transitions. They whispered to Hecate in the shadows of the kitchen hearth, asking for protection during nights when the master's temper was sharp. They prayed to Hypnos, the god of sleep, to grant them rest without dreams. Dreams were dangerous. In dreams, the concubine might remember a mother's touch, a brother's laughter, the feeling of running barefoot in the dust before capture or sale. These memories could undo him if they surfaced during waking hours. And so, he prayed for forgetfulness, for a sleep that was blank and silent, like the surface of still water. But the rituals of the household rarely allowed true rest. The concubine's day continued through the afternoon, preparing for the next round of duties. He helped arrange the household for guests, laying out pillows, pouring libations to the gods, setting the mood for the symposium that would follow. The symposium was not merely a drinking party, it was a social theater where alliances were built, philosophies debated, and status performed. The concubine was part of this performance, moving between guests with wine and song, his body always on display. He was not allowed to show exhaustion. His smile was part of the household's image, just as much as the polished bronze cups and the intricate mosaic floors. Some concubines developed soft strategies for surviving these long nights. They focused on the patterns of the floor tiles as they walked, tracing geometric designs with their eyes to distract from the numbness in their feet. They timed their breaths to the rhythm of the music, using the liar's notes as anchors in the swirling chaos of conversation and laughter. They watched the guests carefully, cataloging who drank too much, who whispered secrets, who might be a threat to their master, and therefore to themselves. In these moments, the concubine became a kind of silent guardian of the household's reputation. His beauty distracted, his service soothed, but his mind remained sharp. He knew when to remove a cup before it spilled, when to intervene with a joke to break tension, and when to subtly guide the master away from dangerous topics. These were not just acts of obedience, they were acts of survival. If the master's reputation fell, the concubine's life would fall with it. Some concubines were called upon to entertain guests beyond the simple roles of serving food or singing songs. There were private performances in back rooms, moments when the line between companionship and submission blurred entirely. These encounters were expected, not spoken of openly, but fully understood by all present. The concubine learned to navigate these moments with the same practiced grace as every other duty, keeping his emotions folded inward, his body performing while his mind drifted to safer places. When the guests finally left and the symposium ended, the concubine's night was not yet over. He helped clean the spilled wine, gathered the scattered wreaths from the floor, and adjusted the cushions. Only then did he return to his mat, his small corner of the house, where he once again lay quietly, staring into the shadows, waiting for sleep that might never fully come. As you lie still now, letting your breath soften into the hush of the night, imagine these lives, the boys who carried the weight of beauty and silence, who became the soft machinery behind the rituals of ancient power. Their names are lost, their stories unrecorded, but their presence shaped the private world of history. They were not citizens nor slaves in the common sense. They existed in a delicate space between roles, between self and shadow. And in this soft quiet, their echoes remain not as cries, but as whispers, as breath, as the unseen rhythm beneath the surface of civilization's grand stories, still moving gently through the folds of time in the dim blue haze that precedes. Dawn, the concubine's world entered its softest, most dangerous phase, the space where exhaustion blurred into numbness, but duty never ceased. The household of the master, grand and adorned with polished stone, lay hushed beneath the weight of its wealth. Outside, the cicadas began to fade, their nighttime chorus giving way to the first hesitant calls of morning birds. But inside the marble walls, in the shadowed corners of grand rooms and narrow servant corridors, the concubine remained awake, locked inside the choreography of his role. He had learned by now that beauty was not merely a possession. It was a prison. His body, so carefully maintained, was a tool not for his benefit, but for someone else's pleasure, status, and control. His limbs moved with grace. His skin remained soft beneath the daily layers of oil and ash-infused soaps. But each of these rituals tied him more deeply to the expectations placed upon him. He was not allowed to age naturally, nor to carry the ordinary marks of a living body. A scar would have been a crime against the master's investment. A cough would be met with suspicion. Even the smallest sign of personal change had to be hidden, managed, erased. There were treatments for this, a secret set of regimens whispered between older concubines and the household's healers. Boys mixed crushed pearls into pastes to brighten their skin. They soaked their faces in milk infused with mint to reduce signs of fatigue. Some were instructed to bite their lips gently before entering a room so that the blood would rise and redden them naturally. These were not beauty rituals in the modern sense. They were survival practices, ways to remain useful, to maintain the illusion that they were more than flesh, that they were timeless, permanent, perfect. But beneath the polished exterior, the concubine's mind carried the quiet tremors of endurance. Each day, he navigated a world of invisible rules. How to sit, how to lower the eyes, but not too much. How to walk without drawing attention, yet remain always present. How to smile with just enough warmth to soothe the master's temper, but never enough to suggest inner joy that might be mistaken for insolence. These calculations lived in his muscles. They were not choices anymore. They were reflexes, carved into the body over years of careful conditioning. Some boys marked time, not by seasons, but by masters. A concubine might serve one man for years, learning his moods, his habits, his cycles of affection and cruelty. Then, with little warning, he could be given away as a gift to another household, transferred like property to secure a political alliance or settle a debt. The concubine had no say in these decisions. One day, he poured wine in Athens. The next, he might find himself on a boat bound for Rhodes or Crete, his life packed into a single bag of perfumed tunics, his fate rewritten by men who never asked his opinion. In these transitions, the concubine learned to detach further from the idea of home. Home was not a place, it was the interior space of survival, the hidden corners of his mind where he stored fragments of selfhood, memories of childhood, of family, of his first name before it was stripped from him, were kept folded away like old fabric, worn but never discarded. Some concubines whispered their real names into empty rooms at night, just to remind themselves they still existed beyond the role they performed. But names were dangerous. In the master's house, the concubine was often renamed, his original identity replaced by something softer, more pleasing to Greek ears. Names like Lysian, Dorian, or Kalos were given names that meant sweet, gift, or simply beautiful. These new names wrapped the concubine more tightly into the system, stripping away the roots of where he came from, the language of his mother, the voice of his past. And yet, in the deepest part of the night, when the house was finally still, some boys whispered their old names into the crooks of their arms or against the cold stone walls, just to hear them spoken aloud one more time. In larger estates, where several concubines lived together under one roof, these boys developed private rituals to cope with the shared burden of their roles. They would brush each other's hair at night, not just for appearance, but as an act of tenderness in a world that allowed none. They learned to communicate in glances during the day, small flickers of the eyes that said, "I see you, I understand. You are not alone." They shared knowledge, passing along techniques for avoiding the master's temper, for predicting when a guest might make demands that went beyond music or poetry. They whispered warnings when a new concubine arrived, teaching him how to survive, how to breathe through the moments when his body no longer felt like his own. In rare moments, they played small games together, reciting riddles under their breath or carving tiny symbols into hidden corners of the house. These symbols were not meant for rebellion. They were meant for memory. A crescent moon scratched into a floor tile, a bird's wing drawn behind a curtain, a spiral etched beneath a bedpost. Each symbol carried a silent message. We were here. We endured. These traces, invisible to the masters, were secret acts of selfhood, quiet markers that resisted total erasure. But not all concubines had the chance to create such bonds. Some served in isolation, in small households where there were no other boys to share the burden. For these concubines, the loneliness was profound. They existed alone beneath the gaze of one master, their days consumed by a single set of expectations, their nights spent listening for footsteps in the dark. In these isolated cases, a mind became both refuge and threat. Some boys found solace in crafting entire imaginary worlds inside their heads, places where they lived freely, where they owned fields or played games with childhood friends who existed now only in memory. Others slipped into patterns of thought that dulled emotion, repeating mantras to flatten their feelings into something manageable. The household's healers sometimes noticed these signs, the tremble of a hand, the distant look in the eyes, and prescribed herbs to calm the nerves. But the herbs did not change the root of the suffering. They merely masked it, the same way perfumes masked the bruises. Some concubines developed physical symptoms over time: stomach pains, trembling limbs, sudden fevers with no clear cause. Ancient medical texts described these as diseases of delicate spirits, though today we might understand them as trauma lived through the body. But the system had no room for such interpretations. The boy was either useful or he was not. If he faltered too visibly, he risked replacement. And so the concubine learned to smile through illness, to bow through pain, to continue his duties with a softness that concealed all inner struggle. In the later stages of their service, when concubines grew too old for the role of boy, but were not yet fully discarded, some were assigned new positions within the household. They became trainers of younger concubines, passing down the lessons of silence and grace. Others managed the master's wardrobe, prepared ceremonial robes, or arranged jewelry for public events. In this phase, they walked the thin line between memory and function, teaching new boys how to survive, while quietly mourning the parts of themselves that had already disappeared. Some found unexpected peace in these roles. They no longer needed to perform beauty directly, and their bodies were no longer inspected daily. They existed in the quiet background of the house, ghost-like but still present, carrying the knowledge of decades in their eyes. Others found this phase even harder, the transition from being desired to being ignored, from being touched constantly to being invisible. Both forms of existence carried pain, but at least in invisibility there was space to breathe. And as the years slipped by, some concubines disappeared entirely from the records. They slipped through the cracks of history, their stories unrecorded, their names lost. But traces of them remain in the margins of medical texts, in the patterns of household inventories, in the fading images on pottery, where a boy pours wine for a reclining master. As you lie still now, listening to the quiet of your room, imagine those ancient nights, the breath of a concubine in the dark, waiting for morning, crafting private memories beneath the weight of public silence. Their stories did not survive in books, but they exist in the soft spaces between history's grand narratives, in the hush between battles, between laws, between the loud speeches of men in marble forums. They are there still, soft as breath, steady as time, reminders that survival itself is a form of quiet courage in the gray hush before sunrise. When the sky was neither night nor day, the concubine remained still, curled in the quiet pose of someone who had long since forgotten what it meant to sleep without fear. His body, arranged neatly on the cold mat near the master's bed or against the far wall of the andron, carried the memory of every silent night that came before. He knew exactly how to lie without wrinkling his linen wrap, how to control his breathing so his chest rose only slightly, how to keep his heartbeat steady, even when his mind drifted dangerously close to the sharp edges of memory. In ancient Greece, the male concubine was not a passing figure in the house. He was an institution, embedded into the private rituals of elite life. His role was woven between the folds of philosophy and power, between the lines of public speeches and military conquests, always present but never named in the official records. And as he lay still in the pre-dawn silence, he carried the weight of this invisibility with him. Some concubines, over years of service, developed patterns of thought to manage the endless repetition of their lives. They broke time into fragments, counting the number of symposiums since the last new moon, measuring the master's moods against the tides of the seasons. They created small internal calendars, marking moments not by festivals or market days, but by private events. The day a new boy arrived, the night the master whispered a secret, and then forgot it by morning, the hour when the concubine realized he no longer remembered the sound of his native language. Memory became its kind of burden. Some boys tried to erase their pasts on purpose, forcing themselves to forget the details of their first home, their mother's face, the songs they had once sung. Others clung to these fragments fiercely, wrapping them like protective charms around their minds, whispering old words in secret, even though their tongues had been retrained to speak perfect Attic Greek, this dual life being what the master wanted while holding on to the shadows of the self was the concubine's greatest skill and his greatest wound. During the day, the rituals continued. The concubine's body was oiled and massaged, not for his comfort, but for display. Some masters preferred boys to remain pale, untouched by the sun, so the concubines spent most of their time indoors, their skin preserved like marble statues. Others demanded soft muscles without bulk, so the boys were instructed in gentle stretches and dances designed to maintain grace without strength. Their diets were managed carefully sweet fruits and watered wine to keep the lips full, nuts, and honey to soften the skin, but little meat, lest the body grow too heavy or masculine. Some were given herbal teas laced with silphium or fennel to control their digestion and prevent unwanted signs of maturity. Their voices were also managed. If a concubine's voice began to deepen, he was taught to speak in higher tones, to sing in registers that masked his natural growth. Boys practiced this alone, sometimes until their throats ached, repeating soft verses into the corners of rooms, where no one else could hear. Their voices were part of the performance, just like their bodies, a carefully curated sound that preserved the illusion of eternal youth. There were ceremonies for every part of the day. The preparation of the master's bath was its ritual. The concubine poured warm water over the master's shoulders, mixed oils with perfumes chosen for the master's mood, and scrubbed the skin gently with sponges made from sea creatures harvested specifically for this purpose. These acts were framed as affection in public discourse, but were, in truth, expected duties, performed with practiced tenderness that hid the absence of choice. Some boys whispered private prayers during these tasks, not to the Olympian gods, but to the smaller household spirits, the Lares, the Penates, or even unnamed forces that watched over servants and shadows. These prayers were not for favor or power. They were simple wishes. Let me survive the day. Let me stay invisible just long enough to be safe. When visitors arrived, the concubine's role shifted again. He became the house's public face of refinement, a symbol of wealth and culture. He poured wine, adjusting the crater's angle so the liquid arched beautifully into each guest's cup. He offered small morsels of food, plucked grapes from silver trays, and held perfumes in delicate hands while guests refreshed themselves between courses. But his presence also served another purpose. He was a living signal of the master's dominance, a display of control. To own beauty, to manage it perfectly, to present it without scandal, it was part of an elite man's social performance. And the concubine knew this. He knew his role was as much about the master's reputation as it was about personal service. Some masters encouraged their guests to comment on the concubine's appearance, to admire his movements, to praise his skill in music or poetry. These compliments, though seemingly kind, were traps. The concubine was expected to respond with exactly the right amount of gratitude, never too warm, never too cold. A wrong smile could lead to punishment later. An overly bold gaze could mean isolation or worse. The concubine navigated these social landmines daily, balancing his expressions like a tightrope walker balancing over an endless drop. But there were private moments, 2 times when the house fell quiet between social events, when the master traveled, when the concubine was left alone with his thoughts. In these rare silences, some boys practiced small acts of personal ritual. They counted the lines on their palms, tracing them slowly with fingers to remind themselves they were still human, still real beneath the performance. Others recited lines of poetry in their heads, not the verses the master requested, but the secret lines they composed in the darkness poems about the sea, about the freedom of animals, about wind and sky, and the body untethered. These poems were never spoken aloud. They were kept like seeds in the concubine's mind, waiting for soil that would never come. There were stories of concubines who tried to escape, slipping away in the dead of night, hiding in the labyrinthine alleys of the city, or fleeing to nearby villages where no one knew their faces. But these attempts rarely succeeded. Greek society was tightly woven, and the networks of ownership extended far beyond a single household. A runaway concubine had few places to hide. Some were caught and returned. Others simply disappeared, their fates unknown, their names unrecorded. The fear of this fate kept most boys compliant, trapped not by chains, but by the invisible walls of necessity. Some concubines fantasized about old age, imagining a time when they would no longer be desired, when they might fade into the background and be left alone. But old age was not guaranteed. Few concubines lived long enough to grow old. Their usefulness faded long before their bodies did, and the system rarely allowed for graceful retirement. Those who survived into middle life often became teachers of new concubines, passing on the knowledge of performance and survival. Others were reassigned to household management, kept in the shadows of the house where their presence was no longer visible to guests, but still needed for silent labor. In rare cases, a concubine was freed formally, given a token of manumission, a ring, a document, a handshake before witnesses. But even freedom came with its burdens. A freed concubine had no family, no place in the citizen body, no means of reclaiming a life that had been erased by years of service. Some drifted into temple service, becoming attendants of deities who welcomed the displaced. Others became healers, using the knowledge they had gathered in private to tend to bodies, not for beauty, but for care. And a few became poets, writing under false names, their verses veiled in metaphor, hiding truths no audience would fully understand. As you breathe softly now, lying in the quiet of your night, imagine the slow, careful breath of the concubine, awake in the dark, counting hours until morning. His story is not found in grand histories or marble inscriptions. It exists in the spaces between the empty rooms, the silent rituals, the softness of endurance, beneath the sharpness of control. His life was not written in letters, but in gestures. A bowed head, a controlled smile, a whispered name spoken only when no one could hear. And in this gentle moment before sleep, his memory lingers not as tragedy, but as a soft, steady presence, reminding us of the hidden lives beneath history's loudest stories dot in the softest, coldest hour before sunrise, the hour when the oil lamps burned low and the marble floors of the master's house seemed to exhale the last chill of the night. The concubine lay perfectly still, his breath shallow, his body arranged as if part of the furniture. The role of a male concubine in ancient Greece was not just about beauty or servitude. It was about becoming an object of ritual, an instrument of routine. His presence marked the rhythm of the house. The household rose when he rose. The master's moods shifted with his responses. The concubine was both invisible and essential, a human shaped into a silent clock that measured out the private time of the elite. Some concubines lived for years in this liminal space between personhood and property, learning to read the master's every subtle cue. They knew, instinctively, the sound of a footstep that meant anger, the weight of a breath that meant loneliness, the quiet shifting of robes that meant tonight would not be an easy night. Their lives became attuned to another man's desires, not through affection, but through necessity. Love, as the philosophers spoke of it, was a concept for free men. For the concubine, Love was dangerous, something to be suppressed, folded away beneath layers of practiced detachment. But the body remembers what the mind tries to erase. Some concubines developed chronic illnesses, tremors in the hands, persistent, stomach pains, sudden fevers that came and went without explanation. The healers of the time called these conditions soft maladies, illnesses of delicate spirits. Today, we might recognize them as the physical toll of constant submission, of living under the unrelenting gaze of ownership. And yet the concubine smiled, always smiled. His role required softness, patience, and above all, performance. There were moments when the master's friends visited and praised the concubine's beauty, commenting on the curve of his neck, the way he poured wine. Without spilling a drop, the boy would bow gently, accept the compliments, and remember every word for later. He carried not just wine, but information. He became an archive of private conversations, storing the jealousies, alliances, and betrayals whispered over dinner. But he could never speak of these things. His knowledge was a locked chest without a key, sealed forever by the threat of punishment. Sometimes the master asked him to recite poetry, to sing songs that praised beauty and love. He did so with perfect tone, even when the words stung. He learned to perform desire without feeling it, to mimic longing without ever exposing his own heart. His eyes were trained to soften at the right moments, to widen just enough to signal innocence, but never so much as to appear foolish. In public, he became the emblem of the master's refinement, a boy who played the lyre, who quoted Sappho, who served honeyed figs with a smile. In private, he was a vessel for silence, for absorption. Some concubines survived by developing private languages. Some boys invented gestures, tiny shifts of the fingers, invisible nods shared with other concubines when no one else was looking. These codes were not for rebellion, but for sanity. A flick of the thumb might mean, hold on, endure. A brush of the sleeve might mean, tonight will be difficult, but you are not alone. These small signals were lifelines in a world where speech was dangerous. Other boys survived through the creation of mental rituals. They imagined themselves as stones at the bottom of rivers, soft, polished by the current, untouched by the noise above. They practiced meditative breathing, matching their inhales and exhales to the movements of the household. When the master laughed, they exhaled softly. When the master frowned, they inhaled, holding their breath until the moment passed. These patterns gave structure to an otherwise shapeless life. Some concubines became so skilled in these arts of silence and softness that they were kept in service far longer than expected. They became fixtures of the house, living shadows who managed younger boys, who trained the new arrivals in the rituals of obedience. They taught them how to bow without bending too far, how to pour oil over the master's hands without trembling, how to keep the face serene even when the body protested. These older concubines became caretakers of a system that had once consumed them. Some found comfort in this role. At least they were no longer touched, no longer inspected daily for flaws. Others found it crueler, a living reminder that they had become part of the machinery of control, teaching others to survive the same soft torments. A few boys were given small freedoms as they aged out of service. They might be permitted to visit the market alone, to buy olives or bread, always with the master's seal tied around their neck to prevent escape. These errands became the closest thing to freedom they would know. Some concubines cherished these moments, walking slowly through the streets, breathing in the air of the city beyond the household walls. They did not run, because they had nowhere to run to, but for a few moments they could imagine what it would be like to belong only to themselves. Some boys sought meaning in religion, becoming devotees of lesser-known gods, the gods of thresholds and crossroads. They whispered prayers to Hermes, not for speed or theft, but for invisibility, for safe passage between the private world of the master's house and the public world where their role was undefined. A few became quietly involved in the cults of Hecate, goddess of boundaries, hoping that she might guard the door between who they were and who they had to be. The lines between self and role blurred so completely over time that some boys no longer remembered which parts of their smiles were real. They had trained their bodies to move without resistance, their voices to soften automatically, their eyes to reflect exactly what the master wanted to see. And yet, inside, a hidden place remained, a small, protected self that no ritual could erase. Some concubines described this hidden place in fragments of poems or private carvings left in forgotten corners of the house. A symbol etched beneath a bench, a single word scratched onto the underside of a ceramic dish, a quiet mark left in the grain of a wooden door. These were not messages for others to find. They were messages to themselves, proof that they had existed, that they had endured, that they had carried something untouched beneath the layers of performance. There were nights when the concubine closed his eyes and imagined a different life, not as a grand fantasy, but as a whisper. A life where his body belonged only to him, where his name was spoken by someone who loved him without ownership. He knew this life would likely never come, but the imagining of it was its form of resistance. It was the smallest rebellion, to hold on to hope in the quiet dark, beneath the weight of the system that had taught him to forget. As you rest now, listening to the hush of your room, think of these boys not as statues or fading figures on ancient pottery, but as real people who lived through each moment of beauty and control. Their lives were measured not in victories or defeats, but in the delicate art of surviving, of keeping breath steady beneath another man's desire, of carving out a secret corner of selfhood in a world that wanted them to disappear. And in this quiet moment, as you drift towards sleep, know that their stories linger still not in the grand histories, but in the soft spaces between them, steady, silent, and very much alive dot in the last fragile moments before dawn, when the ancient Greek household shivered softly in the night's final breath. The concubine remained awake, his eyes half-lidded, his body arranged in practiced stillness. He had survived another night, a small victory wrapped in silence. For the concubine, survival was not marked by grand events or moments of escape. It was measured in these quiet intervals, the shift from night to morning, the soft exhale when the master's hand did not reach for him in anger, the gentle relief of hearing footsteps fade away rather than approach. These small, invisible triumphs stitched together a life lived entirely in the spaces between other people's desires. The system that held him in place was older than his memory. In ancient Greece, male concubinage was not a scandal, it was a structure. It operated beneath the polished veneer of philosophy and citizenship, beneath the marble statues of heroes and the golden wreaths of democracy. It was hidden in plain sight, woven into the rituals of daily life. The concubine was not a citizen. He could not vote, nor own land, nor speak openly in the agora. But he was always present in the private rooms where real power moved, in the symposium halls, the bath chambers, the soft corners of bedrooms where decisions were whispered between bites of figs and sips of honeyed wine. He was both witness and ghost, both cherished and disposable, a human being reshaped into something else. His training began the moment he was purchased or taken into the household. His body was soft, refined, and maintained like an expensive object. Older concubines taught him how to walk without sound, how to hold his hands with graceful stillness, how to step precisely into the spaces where his presence was required, but his voice was not. They taught him how to listen, to catch the subtle cues in the master's breath, the shift of a sandal against marble, the tension in a sentence unfinished. He learned how to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to pour wine at the exact right angle, to smile without revealing a single personal thought. His existence became a mirror, reflecting the desires of the man who owned him, offering no hint of the inner life hidden behind his eyes. Over time, the concubines stopped asking when his service would end. The idea of an endpoint faded into abstraction. The masters rarely made plans for their concubines beyond the moment of usefulness. Some boys were given away as political gifts, tokens of loyalty exchanged between aristocrats. Others were sold quietly when they began to age, their bodies no longer fitting the soft ideal of boyhood beauty that Greek society fetishized. A few were manumitted granted freedom with a formal ceremony, but even this came with conditions. A freed concubine remained marked by his past, whispered about in markets and baths, his reputation always trailing behind him like a shadow. Those who were lucky found ways to live quietly after their service. They opened small shops or became tutors, teaching music or poetry to children of the elite. Some joined religious cults where their gender ambiguity was not questioned, temples of Dionysus, Cybele, or Hecate, where roles were blurred and new rituals allowed for different forms of existence. But most simply disappeared from the records, their stories fading with time, their names unrecorded. The ones who remained in service for decades became part of the household furniture, not touched as often, not shown off to guests, but still expected to perform the soft rituals of care. They managed the younger boys, teaching them how to endure the same system that had devoured their youth. Some concubines, in their later years, were tasked with preserving the household's beauty standards. They monitored the new concubines' diets, adjusted their oils and perfumes, and corrected their posture when they poured wine or knelt at the master's feet. They enforced the same rules that had once been enforced upon them, their compassion buried beneath the necessity of survival. But in the private corners of their minds, they carried memories the house would never acknowledge. They remembered the first time they were chosen, the first time they were renamed, the first night they lay awake, counting the patterns in the ceiling above the master's bed. They remembered the cold baths, the oiled massages, the whispered promises that were never kept. And most of all, they remembered the feeling of their selfhood soft and small, tucked away in the quiet folds of memory, still alive beneath the layers of performance. Some left tiny marks behind, not for rebellion, but for remembrance. A concubine might scratch his old name into the underside of a wooden stool. Another might bury a stone from his homeland in the garden courtyard, hidden beneath the roots of awe. An olive tree. These acts were small, private declarations. I existed. I was here. I survived. There were no grand monuments built for these boys, no statues erected in their honor. Their beauty was displayed, their voices used, their bodies borrowed for rituals of pleasure and power, but their inner lives remained unspoken. They were part of the architecture of the private Greek world, as necessary and as overlooked as the slaves who cleaned the courtyards or lit the lamps at dusk. Yet, in the stillness of the night, the concubine's breath carried history, the unrecorded kind, the kind that lingers in silences and shadows. His life was not a tragedy in the way the poets described tragedy, with gods and fate and public. Ruin. His life was a quieter kind of sorrow, the daily repetition of compliance, the soft erosion of the self, the careful maintenance of beauty in a world that refused to see him as fully human. And still, he endured. He endured. Through whispered prayers to unknown gods, through secret memories of rivers and fields far from the city walls, through the silent pact he made with himself each morning to survive one more day, the concubine lived, not because he had a choice, but because endurance became its form of resistance. As you rest now, eyes half closed, breath softening into sleep, imagine the soft footsteps of these boys in the stone halls of history. Their lives were not written in books, but they were real. Their shadows linger still not in ruins or temples, but in the quiet spaces where beauty and control intersect, where bodies become symbols and where the human spirit finds ways to remain, quietly breathing beneath the weight of silence. Their story does not end. It fades gently, like the last. Moments of night before the sun returns, soft as breath, steady as memory, waiting patiently in the dark.